My name is Timothy Perez, and back in 2018, I decided to take my RV up to Lake Superior Provincial Park in Ontario for some peace and quiet. Being cooped up in the city was starting to make me feel like a sardine in a can, and I figured some fresh air might do me good. Besides, I've always believed that nature and I have an understanding. I don't bother it, and it doesn't bother me. I've never been the rugged outdoorsman type. My idea of hiking involves a well-marked trail and a picnic at the end. But the allure of the open road and the promise of solitude were too tempting to pass up. So I packed my essentials. A week's worth of snacks, a stack of books I'd been meaning to read, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. The drive was picturesque, with the trees flaunting their autumn colors like they were showing off. By the time I reached the park, the sun was casting a golden hue over the lake, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I found a secluded spot near the water, set up camp, and made myself a cup of coffee. This isn't so bad, I thought. Maybe I should write a book. Aller's Adventures in the Wild. As dusk settled, I decided to light a campfire. There's something hypnotic about watching flames dance. It's like nature's television. I was roasting marshmallows, because what's a camping trip without s'mores? When I heard footsteps crunching leaves behind me. Evening, a voice said. I turned to see a man standing at the edge of my campsite. He was tall and gaunt, with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they'd been through a war zone. His eyes had a peculiar glint, one that made me instinctively uneasy. Evening, I replied cautiously. Can I help you with something? Just passing through, he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Name's Jedediah, but folks call me Jed. Aller? I offered, not that he asked. Beautiful night, isn't it? He stepped closer, eyeing the marshmallows. Sure is. Mind if I join you for a bit? Every alarm bell in my head was ringing, but I didn't want to be rude. Actually, I was just about to turn in. Long drive and all? He tilted his head, the smile fading. Fair enough. You take care now. Will do, I said, watching as he disappeared into the shadows. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Well, that wasn't creepy at all, I muttered, deciding it was indeed time to call it a night. I extinguished the fire and secured the RV. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of pine. I convinced myself that I'd overreacted the night before. Maybe Jed was just a harmless drifter. After breakfast, I decided to explore a nearby trail. I left a note on the dashboard, a habit from watching too many true crime shows, grabbed my backpack, and set off. The trail was serene, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and leaves crunching underfoot. I was about an hour in when I noticed something odd, a campsite just off the path, but it looked abandoned. Curious, I ventured closer. Tents were collapsed and belongings were strewn about as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Unease settled in my stomach. This is how people end up in horror movies, I joked nervously to myself. I decided to head back. As I turned, I nearly bumped into Jed. Whoa, you startled me, I exclaimed. Sorry about that, he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. What brings you here? Just hiking, I replied, trying to sound casual. You? Same, he said, his gaze fixed on me. Shame about what happened here. Yeah, looks like they left in a hurry, he chuckled softly. Or something made them leave. I swallowed hard. Well, I should get going. Don't let me keep you, he said, stepping aside. I walked briskly back to the trail, feeling his eyes on me the whole time. By the time I reached my RV, my heart was pounding. Maybe it's time to move on to another site, I thought, backing up when I heard rustling behind me. I spun around, half expecting Jed, but it was another man, this one wearing a park ranger uniform. Sorry to startle you, he said. I'm Ranger Thompson, just making my rounds. Oh, thank goodness, I sighed in relief. Everything all right? You look a bit shaken. I debated whether to mention Jed, but decided I might sound paranoid. Just had an odd encounter earlier. Do you know a man named Jedediah around here? The ranger's expression darkened. Jedediah Clark? Yeah, goes by Jed, he nodded grimly. We've had reports about him. I'd advise you to be cautious. He's not well. Not well how? I pressed. Look, it's probably best if you relocate to a more populated area of the park, he suggested. Safety in numbers. Understood, I said, feeling a knot in my stomach. Thanks for the warning. As he left, I hurried to finish packing. Just as I was about to start the engine, I realized I'd left my map on the picnic table. I stepped out to grab it when something heavy struck me from behind. Everything went black. I awoke to a splitting headache and found myself tied to a chair inside what looked like an old cabin. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern, casting eerie shadows on the walls adorned with hunting trophies. "Rise and shine," came Jed's voice from the darkness. "What do you want?" I demanded, struggling against the ropes. He stepped into the light, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "Company. Is that too much to ask?" "Kidnapping isn't exactly the way to make friends," I retorted. He laughed. "Oh, but we're past pleasantries now." "Look, if it's money you want." "Money?" He interrupted. "You think this is about money?" "No, Aller. This is about survival." "Survival?" He began pacing. "City folks like you come here thinking you own the place, leaving your trash, making noise, disrupting the balance." "I'm sorry if I—" "Too late for apologies," he snapped. "You and your kind are a blight." "You're not making any sense," I said, trying to keep him talking while I worked at the knots. He pulled out a hunting knife, examining it thoughtfully. "Sense? Sense is living off the land, respecting its laws, not hiding in metal boxes on wheels." "Okay, noted. I'll just be on my way and promise to leave nature untouched," I said. He shook his head slowly. "Can't let you do that." Before I could respond, there was a loud bang on the door. "Jedediah Clark! This is Ranger Thompson! Open up!" Jed's eyes flickered with rage. "You just couldn't stay quiet, could you?" As he moved toward the door, adrenaline surged through me. I managed to loosen the ropes enough to free one hand. Without thinking, I grabbed a heavy wooden stool and swung with all my might. The stool connected with his shoulder, causing him to drop the knife and stumble. "You little—" he growled. I didn't wait for him to finish. I bolted for the back door, bursting into the cool night air. Later, I learned that Jedediah Clark was a former survivalist who lost his grip on reality after a tragic accident claimed his family. He turned his anguish into misplaced vengeance against anyone he deemed an intruder. Next time someone suggests a nature trip, I'll politely decline and say, "I'm outdoorsy in that I like having drinks on patios." My name is Dylan Gonzalez, and this happened back in 1996 in Wickford, Rhode Island, when I was still green enough to think that the hardest part of my job would be breaking up bar fights over the right way to cook clam chowder. I was raised not far from here, maybe 3 towns over, and I joined the local force for reasons that now seem almost naive, thinking I'd keep drunks out of trouble and help old folks feel safe at night. I'd been on the job a few months, and most days were quiet. The biggest case I'd handled involved a stolen bike that turned out to be borrowed by a neighbor's nephew. But things changed the evening that Merle, the mechanic who ran that grimy little garage by the Rotary, didn't lock up on time. I noticed his shop lights burning well past closing, and when I poked my head in, I found his body lying beside a half-fixed sedan. He'd been stabbed. Blood spread over the cement floor in a dark, uneven shape. His eyes were still open like he'd been interrupted mid-thought. My hand shook as I called for backup. I'd never seen anything like it. Chief Auror arrived first. He was older, gruff, with a head full of silver hair and a way of asking questions that made you feel like you'd already messed up. He didn't say much that night, just examined the body and knelt beside Merle's toolbox. He picked up a bent screwdriver, turned it in the light, and muttered something I couldn't quite hear. Then he rose and said, "Bradley, we're going to need to talk to everyone who was around tonight. Start with the folks at the marina. Merle always worked late when he expected some out-of-town car. Might have been a stranger." I remember stepping out of that garage, the smell of rust and cheap motor oil still in my nose, trying to steady my breathing. Across the street, Miss Varr was at her window, her face pale and creased. She must have seen the commotion. I gave her a nod that was supposed to feel reassuring, but I doubt it did. I felt unsteady myself, like I'd walked into a room expecting a quiet conversation and found a fight breaking out instead. Early the next morning, I visited the marina. A few men stood by the dock, coiling ropes and cursing the gulls. I asked if they'd seen anything strange last night. Mo shrugged it off. One man, Dieter, said he noticed a guy he didn't recognize, a lanky fellow with threadbare jeans and a dirty brown jacket. Said the guy was walking along the waterfront, peering into the windows of parked cars. Dieter remembered this man because of the way he tilted his head as if he had a stiff neck. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, Dieter said. Couldn't guess his age, maybe mid-30s, maybe older. He had this thin mustache and a sunken face, like he'd been living on nothing but coffee. Dieter went to talk to others, but nobody offered more than that. Just a stranger in town. Maybe a drifter. Maybe someone who had something to do with Merle's death. That night, I found myself driving slowly around Wickford's quieter streets, windows down, hoping to catch sight of someone who fit that description. I didn't think I'd know what to do if I spotted him. I wasn't exactly sure if I was ready to confront a murderer, but I wanted to at least feel productive. 2 days passed. I interviewed anyone who might have been near that garage. I pored over old records, asked about any similar cases, but got nothing. Then, on a damp Wednesday afternoon, we got another call. A fisherman named Roy was found dead behind the fish market. Same pattern. A knife wound. Nobody had heard a struggle. This time, there were muddy footprints leading away toward the back alley. We measured them. Men's size, about 10.5, and noted that the man likely dragged something along with him. There were scratches on the pavement, maybe from a broken crate he stepped over, or maybe from a piece of metal he carried. I felt my stomach twist. 2 murders in a week. Both victims town regulars. Roy was a kind man who gave free clams to kids on weekends. Seeing his body face down and cold made everything feel wrong. It pressed into my head the idea that I couldn't just patrol for unlocked doors and petty theft anymore. There was a killer here. Someone who moved fast and silent, then vanished. After Roy's murder, the tension around town grew. The local diner stayed crowded later, people clustering inside for safety. Chief Oror didn't give me much direction beyond keep asking around, as though he hoped I'd stumble into a clue. I tried not to show my fear, but my voice cracked when I told my neighbor Ruth to lock her doors. I made lame jokes about learning karate from a VHS tape, trying to keep things light. But nobody laughed. That Thursday night, I sat in the station house, just me and Deputy Cruz. He was older, always chewing gum. We were checking leads when we got a call from old Miss Vanny. She whispered that she saw a man outside her backyard, bending over something near her tool shed. Cruz and I rushed out, cruiser headlights cutting through the dark. We found footprints in the damp soil. No man. But we found something that made my heart pound, a bloody rag tucked under her porch steps. It smelled awful. I felt sweat along my collar. Whoever we were after, he'd been creeping close to homes, maybe looking for another victim. For the next several days, nobody died. I was grateful, but uneasy. It felt like he might be waiting for something. That weekend, Chief Oror organized a patrol schedule that made our lives miserable. Cruz and I walked the streets at odd hours, peering into alleys and lots. I barely slept, kept picturing that stranger's narrow face in my mind. Late Sunday afternoon, I visited the marina again. The boats bobbed in the greenish water. The gulls made a racket. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man hunched over near an abandoned bait shack, tugging something out from behind a pile of old lobster traps. I approached, trying to appear casual. "Hello there," I called. He turned slowly. It was the man Dieter had described. Thin face, mustache, jacket stained with who knows what, eyes ringed with tired shadows. He squinted at me like I was intruding on his personal business. "Evening," he said, voice quiet. I stepped closer, one hand near my holster. "I'm Dylan Gonzalez," I said. "Haven't seen you around before. You visiting?" He forced a grin. "Passing through," he said. Then he coughed and spat into the water. I noticed a slight tremble in his fingers and how he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Heard about some trouble in town," he added, eyes narrowing. "People getting hurt. That must be hard on a small force." I nodded, trying to read him. "We're managing," I said. "Say, what's your name?" He frowned. "Name's Victor." He wiped his mouth and stepped back. He smelled of sweat and rotting fish, like he'd been sleeping near spoiled catch. "I should get going," he said, turning away. Before I could press him, he slipped behind the shack and around the corner. By the time I followed, he was gone. All I caught was a glimpse of his jacket disappearing behind a stack of crates. I had nothing to hold him on. But I knew something about the way he spoke, something about that grin. It made me uneasy. That night, I told Cruz about Victor. We decided to keep an eye on the marina. We borrowed an old fishing skiff and stayed out on the water, watching the docks from a distance. Huddled together under blankets, we barely spoke, just sipped coffee and tried to stay awake. Around midnight, we heard a muffled cry. We scrambled out of the boat and onto the dock. The sound came from one of the old storage sheds behind the harbor master's office. We crept forward. "Police," Cruz called, a little louder this time. We heard a choking sound, then a heavy thump. The door to the shed was slightly open. I eased it open with my foot, flashlight high. Inside, a local handyman named Carl lay on the floor, his chest soaked in red. He wasn't moving. On the far side of the shed stood Victor, holding a long blade, his face twisted with anger. He looked startled to see us. Then he rushed forward. "Cruz, watch out!" I shouted, stepping in front. Victor swung the knife wildly. I jumped back, heart pounding, while Cruz tried to circle behind him. Victor slashed at Cruz's arm, opening a nasty wound. Cruz cried out and fell to one knee, clutching his arm. "Drop it!" I yelled, drawing my pistol. Victor sneered. He lunged toward me, the blade flashing in the weak light. I fired once, hitting him in the shoulder. He staggered but didn't go down. Instead, he threw himself at me, knocking me into a pile of old ropes. My back hit hard and the gun flew from my hand. Victor raised the knife again. I could smell his breath, stale and bitter, and see the sweat on his brow. I kicked at his knee, making him stumble. "Cruz!" I yelled. "The gun!" Cruz groaned, reaching out, trying to find the pistol, but it had slid under a crate. Victor's blade grazed my forearm. The pain was hot, immediate. I pushed him off and scrambled backward, grabbing a loose metal pipe from the floor. He rushed again, and I swung hard, catching him in the jaw. He grunted and fell sideways, the knife clattering to the ground. I grabbed his wrist and twisted. He howled and tried to break free. Cruz found the gun and aimed it at him, blood dripping from his own arm. "Don't move," Cruz shouted, his voice shaking. Victor froze, eyes flicking between us. I pressed my knee into his back and wrenched his arm up. He whimpered. I patted him down and yanked his knife away. My heart hammered, and I could barely think straight, but I knew we had him. We called for backup and an ambulance. Victor spat curses at us, calling us cowards, saying we had no idea who he was or why he did what he did. I didn't care about his motives right then. I cared about Cruz's wound and the bodies Victor had left behind. Carl was gone, just like Merle and Roy. The paramedics said nothing could be done. The quiet little marina now had a line of yellow tape and half the town staring. We booked Victor into custody. He said nothing after that initial outburst. Chief Orr looked relieved when he saw who we'd caught, though he didn't praise us. He just nodded and said, "Good work, Thompson." Cruz got patched up at the clinic, and I needed a few stitches on my arm. The doc asked me, "You okay?" I nodded, though I felt hollow. I spent the rest of that night in my small apartment, the TV off, sipping weak tea. I replayed the fight in my mind. I kept thinking of Carl's last moments, how scared he must have been. I thought of Victor's strange grin at the marina, the quiet way he slid into the shadows when I first met him. He was just a man. No special powers, no monstrous strength, just a desperate, violent man who chose to kill. For what reason? Money? Anger? Some twisted urge? I didn't know, and I guess I never would. But I realized something. Sometimes evil doesn't come dressed in cliches. Sometimes it's just a tired-looking man in a stained jacket passing through your town. The next morning, Wickford felt different. The dockside market opened late. The diners were quieter. People looked my way and nodded, thankful, maybe, but not sure what to say. I still felt uneasy, like my job had changed forever. I'd never asked for heroic moments or epic showdowns. I wanted to keep things simple, to be the guy who told kids to wear helmets and helped old folks find their keys. But now, I knew what violence looked like when it crept into a small place like ours. Chief Oror told me Victor would face trial in Providence. We handed him off, and that was that. No fanfare, no big speeches, just paperwork and a bandage on my arm that I'd have to change daily. I kept my uniform pressed and my humor intact. But I knew I'd stepped into a new understanding of what it meant to wear that badge. Sometimes you find yourself alone in a shed, fighting against a killer with nothing but an old pipe in hand. I guess that's the kind of thing they never really teach you at the academy. And so it ended. But every time I passed that old marina, I remembered the sounds of that night. Cruz's shout, Victor's heavy breath, and Carl lying still. And I wondered how close we came to losing everything. My name is Brian Patel. I was 30 years old when it happened. People think journalists are fearless, but that's not true. We chase stories because we want to expose the truth. The problem is, sometimes the truth is something you were never supposed to find. This happened in Devil's Millhopper Geological State Park, Florida. I'd driven my RV out there looking for a fresh start, or at least that's what I told myself. The truth was, my career was in shambles. A failed expose on a corrupt politician had left me blacklisted from every major news outlet. No one wanted to hire a journalist who fabricated evidence, even though I knew what I saw was real. So I ran, packed up my things, and took a long drive through Florida's forests, looking for something, anything, to make sense of my life again. That's how I ended up here, parked on the edge of the massive sinkhole they called Devil's Millhopper. The locals told me not to camp too close. They spoke about strange noises, people who went missing, stories of voices calling your name in the night. I laughed it off. I didn't believe in that kind of thing. But I was a journalist without a job, and this was as good a story as any. I set up my RV, grabbed my camera, and hiked down into the sinkhole. The trail led into a deep, bowl-shaped pit surrounded by dense trees and waterfalls trickling from the limestone walls. It was beautiful in a way that made me uneasy, like something ancient was watching me. An hour in, I found something I wasn't expecting. A backpack. It was lying near the base of a tree, half covered in mud, the zipper broken. Clothes were strewn around it, along with a phone, cracked, battery dead. A woman's ID peeked out from the front pocket. Sarah Bennett, age 27. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. Had she just left it here? Gotten lost? Then I heard the scream. It came from deeper in the woods, a sharp, ragged cry that cut through the silence and stopped just as suddenly. I ran toward the sound. The trees grew thicker, and the path became harder to follow. I forced my way through, my breath loud in my ears. Then I stopped. A man stood just ahead, near the base of the sinkhole. He was tall, lean, wearing an old flannel shirt and jeans that were too clean for someone who had been hiking. His hair was slicked back, his skin pale. He smiled. "You shouldn't be here." I hesitated. "Did you hear that scream?" He tilted his head. "What scream?" I held up the ID. "This girl. She lost her bag out here. Did you see her?" The man stepped forward. "Maybe. A lot of people get lost here." Something about him put me on edge. His smile was too wide, too knowing. I backed away. "I should get back," I muttered. His grin widened. "Of course. I'll see you soon, Brian." My blood went cold. I hadn't told him my name. I turned and walked quickly back to my RV, refusing to look back. That night, I locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and tried to sleep. But I couldn't. At some point, I heard something outside, a soft tapping on the RV door. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, peering out. No one was there. Then in the reflection, I saw movement behind me. I spun around, but the RV was empty. The next morning, I found something scratched into the dirt just outside the door. "Let me out." I packed my things. I was leaving. As I stepped outside, I nearly ran into someone. It was the man from the woods. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. I stepped back, gripping my keys. "Yeah, something feels off here." His expression flickered just for a second, like he was disappointed. "That's a shame. You were supposed to stay longer." I forced a laugh. "Guess I'll have to come back some other time." He stared at me. Then he grinned again. You've been here before. My stomach clenched. What? You don't remember? He took a step forward. You were here last year. Same RV, same exes, but last time you didn't leave. My fingers tightened around my keys. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. You will, he whispered. I jumped into the RV, locked the door, and started the engine. The man didn't move. He just watched me. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse of him in the side mirror. He wasn't smiling anymore. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. That night at a gas station an hour away, I found something in my back seat. A phone. Cracked. Battery dead. Sarah Bennett's phone. I never went back to Devil's Millhopper, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear his voice. You've been here before. My name's Jeffrey Walker, and this happened back in 1990 in the thick woods of the Boundary Waters up in Minnesota. Now, don't go thinking I'm the type to rattle easily. I'm Ojibwe. Been tracking and hunting since I was a kid, and that's the sort of training that gets you comfortable with the land and everything in it. But there are some things that not even a lifetime in the woods can prepare you for. It was just me and two others from the reservation, Joe White and Ethan Littlecloud. We'd all planned to camp, set some snares, maybe even see what was biting in the lake. Joe was our practical joker, thought everything was funny. And Ethan, well, he was the quiet type, good at reading the land, real level-headed. So if things got tense, I trusted we'd be smart enough to stick together. We hiked in early that morning. There's this old ranger cabin along the lake, barely standing and about as appealing as roadkill stew, but it was good enough to drop our gear. By evening, we'd set up snares and cast our lines without much luck. The forest was thick, the kind where you feel the weight of the trees pressing in from all sides. Sound travels strange out there, muffled, like you're walking underwater. I chalked it up to the dense foliage, but Joe was already making jokes about cursed forests and ghost stories. At one point, Ethan, who doesn't get rattled by much, muttered something about the silence. Birds, squirrels, even the usual mosquito hum seemed absent. I brushed it off, figured we'd just set up camp in a quiet patch. That night, after a few swigs from Joe's flask and a bad attempt at telling ghost stories, we heard something out there. Now, we'd all heard strange noises in the woods before. Things that can send a shiver down your back if you're out there alone. But this was different. Low, grating, like the sound of heavy logs being dragged against each other. Joe started laughing, saying it was just Ethan's stomach, but there was an edge in his voice. He was joking to cover something up. Ethan squinted into the darkness, and I could tell he didn't like this one bit. The sound came closer, slow but steady, like whatever it was didn't mind being heard. Then came a wet thump, like something heavy being dropped, followed by silence. The three of us froze, ears pricked up like hounds. Then the sound started again, closer this time. I could see Ethan's face had gone stone-cold serious. Joe whispered something about checking it out, trying to seem braver than he was. Ethan motioned for silence, then tilted his head toward the trees. He was good with gestures, and what he was saying was clear. He didn't like this one bit. I told Joe to sit tight, but he was already grabbing a flashlight, muttering that he was just going to have a look. As soon as Joe clicked on that flashlight, the beam caught something about 55 yards out, halfway hidden behind the trees. The first thing I saw was that it was tall, easily 6, maybe 8 feet, with long limbs ending in thick, clawed fingers that looked more like gnarled branches than anything human. It had this bent, hunched posture, as if it was studying us, deciding whether we were worth the effort. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and the muscles underneath rippled like a deer's hide. Its face was narrow and stretched back, almost lupine, with a snout like a wolf, but longer, more angular. But the worst part? Its mouth was open, and I swear, the teeth were jagged, mismatched, like a bear trap someone had tried to put back together wrong. Joe whispered something that sounded suspiciously like a prayer, and for a second, I was tempted to join him. The creature moved closer, Not in a lunge, but this slow, deliberate stride, like it had all the time in the world. I'd been stalked by mountain lions before, had coyotes trail me for hours, but this was something else. Ethan nudged me, his voice barely a breath, suggesting we slip back to the cabin. I nodded, trying not to make any sudden moves. Joe, on the other hand, looked like he was about to bolt, his hand clamped around that flashlight like it was his lifeline. We edged backward, every muscle tense. But Joe slipped on a root. The creature's head whipped toward us, and it let out this dry, rasping sound, like sandpaper scraping against rock. Joe was back on his feet in a second, but that was all the invitation it needed. Ethan shouted for us to run, and we bolted. I didn't look back, just pumped my legs as fast as they'd go, hearing Joe's labored breathing right behind me. The thing gave chase, and it wasn't slow. I could hear it thrashing through the underbrush, getting closer with every step. The sound of branches snapping and something scraping over stones and dirt was deafening. I remember thinking we'd make it back to the cabin, that we'd slam the door and huddle inside until dawn. But then Joe stumbled. This time, he didn't get back up in time. Ethan and I turned just as it reached him. The thing's arm shot out, grabbing Joe by the shoulder and dragging him backward like he weighed nothing. Joe screamed, a sound that'll stick with me longer than I care to admit. Ethan wanted to go back for him. I could see it in his face, but the look in my eyes must have told him there was no point. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't something we could fight off with a hunting knife or a flashlight. We made it back to the cabin, slammed the door shut, and barricaded it with whatever we could find. We huddled there in the dark, waiting, barely breathing. The sounds outside grew quiet, but every so often, I thought I could hear something scraping against the walls. Ethan whispered that it was just the wind, but we both knew better. At first light, we crept out. The forest looked different, like the trees were hiding something, like the ground itself had shifted. Joe's body wasn't where he'd been taken, but there was a trail of disturbed earth and bits of fabric. Following it felt like a death sentence, but we couldn't just leave him. Not without knowing what happened. The trail led us to a small clearing about a mile out, where the soil was darker, stained with something I didn't want to examine too closely. And there, scattered among the leaves, were bones. Not all of them Joe's, either. Some looked older, gnawed down and broken. Like whatever that thing was, it had been feeding out here for a long time. We didn't linger. We headed straight back to the ranger station, filed a report, and were met with a look that told us we wouldn't be taken seriously. They called it a bear attack in the paperwork, but neither of us believed that for a second. As for Joe, they found bits of his clothing and some bones, enough to confirm he was dead, but the rest was chalked up to scavengers. Ethan stopped coming out to the woods after that, and I don't blame him. Years later, I heard whispers from some of the older folks on the res about an old creature they'd warned people about, a mix between a man and a beast. Something that hunted in the quietest parts of the forest. They didn't give it a name, just said it was something that didn't belong here. Something that waited. I don't go out there anymore either. And if you ever find yourself near the Boundary Waters, maybe think twice before wandering too far from camp. My name is Kevin Scott. I was 32 years old when it happened. I'd been living out of my RV for the past 8 months, traveling across the country, writing about forgotten places and hidden gems. It was supposed to be an escape. From my ex-wife, from my old life, from the custody battle I knew I was never going to win. This happened in Little Talbot Island, Florida. I picked the spot because it was quiet, off the beaten path, and beautiful in a way that most beaches weren't. No high-rises, no tourists, just rolling dunes, thick patches of forest, and the endless stretch of the Atlantic. Perfect for the kind of travel blog post I was planning. I pulled into the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the sand. The ranger at the entrance had given me a strange look when I told him I was camping alone. "Storm's coming in," he said, eyeing the darkening sky. "Might want to stay closer to town." I shrugged it off. A little bad weather didn't scare me. I'd been through worse. I parked the RV in a secluded spot near the dunes, set up my gear, and spent the evening taking photos. As the sky darkened, a thick mist rolled in from the water, swallowing the landscape. It happened so fast, like a wave crashing over the dunes. Within minutes, the world beyond my headlights was gone. That's when I saw them. Two pinpricks of red light, barely visible through the fog, hovering just above the dunes. At first, I thought they were taillights from another camper's vehicle, but they didn't move. They just watched. I blinked, and they were gone. I laughed to myself. Probably just my imagination. I'd been on the road too long. That night, I locked the doors and stretched out on the tiny bed in my RV, listening to the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. But sleep didn't come easy. At some point, I heard something, a soft, rhythmic scraping. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound came from outside, right next to the RV. I reached for my flashlight and crept toward the window, moving slowly, carefully. My breath fogged up the glass. I saw footprints in the sand. Large, deep, they circled the RV, stopping right at the door. I yanked the curtain shut. The next morning, I found something else. A message carved into the sand just a few feet from my RV. Don't run. The letters were long, jagged, like they'd been made with something sharp. I took a photo, my hands shaking. Maybe some was messing with me. Maybe this was a local trying to scare off outsiders. Or maybe it was something else. I spent the afternoon hiking the trails, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. I kept telling myself there was a logical explanation. The wind, the tide, my own paranoia. But then I found the tent. It was buried beneath the dunes, half collapsed, the fabric shredded. Inside there were old camping supplies, a torn sleeping bag, and a journal. The pages were damp, the ink smudged, but I could still read some of the entries. Something is watching me. Every night it gets closer. I saw the eyes again. They never blink. I tried to leave, but the tide. I keep walking in circles. I don't know if it's me or this place, but I can't find my way out. It waits until I'm too tired to fight. I can hear it breathing. I closed the journal and stood there, heart hammering. Had someone else been here before me? Had they gotten out? As the sun set, I made a decision. I was leaving in the morning. That night, the power in my RV flickered. The radio crackled, the station tuning itself, static giving way to something else, a voice. My own voice. Stay, stay, stay. I lunged forward and turned the radio off. My reflection in the dark screen stared back at me, but for a split second, I swore. I swore I saw it blink. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it, something just outside watching. At some point, I heard scratching. Not at the door. On the roof. Something was up there. I held my breath, gripping my pocket knife, listening as the slow, deliberate movement shifted above me, claws against metal. Then silence. Then a voice. My own voice, whispering from just beyond the RV. Mike, I didn't move. Mike, let me in. I pressed a hand over my mouth. It sounded exactly like me, like I was standing right outside. A shadow passed across the window. I didn't sleep after that. By sunrise, I was ready to go. I threw my things into the RV, turned the key. Nothing. The engine was dead. I sat there, breathing hard, trying to stay calm. I had jumper cables. I could fix this. I could get out. Then I heard footsteps, slow, dragging. I turned my head and saw them. The red eyes. Not just one pair. 3, 4, 5. They hovered above the dunes, blinking in and out of existence, moving closer. I grabbed my flare gun and bolted out the door. I ran, not toward the road, toward the beach. The tide was high, the waves crashing against the shore. If I could just make it to the water, maybe they wouldn't follow. Behind me, the footsteps grew faster. I turned, raised the flare gun, and fired. The light illuminated the dunes for just a moment, and I saw them. Tall, thin, moving wrong, like marionettes with their strings tangled. No faces, just those glowing red eyes. And long, gaping mouths. Then they screamed. The sound was worse than anything I'd ever heard. Worse than gunfire. Worse than sirens. Worse than the worst moments of my life. I turned and sprinted for the water. Then, nothing. The next thing I remember, I was in a fishing boat. An old man shaking me awake. Jesus, son, he muttered. What the hell were you doing out there? I looked back at the shore, but the beach was empty, the dunes undisturbed. They were gone. Or maybe they had never left. I never went back for my RV, never even tried. I didn't care about my gear, my laptop, my camera, because when I checked my phone later, I found something that made my blood run cold. A photo. The last picture I had taken. Me, standing on the beach, and behind me, half visible through the mist, the red eyes, watching. I don't know what they are, but I know they're still there. My name is Bobby Stevens, and this happened to me back in 2000 in Juneau, Alaska, when I thought I'd figured out the best way to escape the chaos of city life. Buy a cabin off the grid, live like Thoreau, and grow an impressive beard. Turns out, I'm not exactly a survivalist, and that beard never really came in. I'd been living in that cabin for about 2 months, wrestling with basic tasks like chopping wood without chopping my foot and getting a fire started without fumbling through half a box of matches. But I liked the solitude, until I started hearing the hum. It wasn't every night, just sporadically. A low, mechanical thrum that vibrated in my chest like a subwoofer cranked too high. At first, I thought it might be the wind against the peaks or some kind of machinery echoing from the city miles away. I even made a joke to myself, maybe Sasquatch got a generator. That night, though, the hum became a roar. My cabin shook, not like an earthquake, but more like the structure itself was resonating. I stumbled outside, bare feet crunching on the frosty gravel, and that's when I saw it. Hovering over the tree line was something enormous, metallic, and, if I'm being honest, uglier than anything I'd ever imagined could fly. It wasn't sleek or aerodynamic, just a mass of haphazardly connected shapes, glowing with what looked like molten gold veins running through their hulls. It didn't zip or glide. It hovered, pulsating, as if deciding what to do next. And then it chose. A beam of light blasted down, not the kind that sweeps around like in old sci-fi movies, but sharp, focused, and immediate. Before I could duck or even think, I was in it, lifted clean off the ground like a rag doll. My first thought wasn't alien abduction. It was, this is the worst way to die, barefoot. The next thing I knew, I was inside. It smelled sterile, but not in a hospital way, more like someone had scrubbed everything with ammonia and forgot to rinse. The walls pulsed faintly, that same molten glow I'd seen outside, tracing patterns that seemed to shift the more I stared. I wasn't alone. There were 2 of them. The closest alien stood about 8'2", shaped like someone had stretched a human silhouette until it was all wrong. Thin as a rake, its limbs too long, with elbows that bent backward like a praying mantis. Its skin was textured like polished onyx, shimmering faintly under the light. The face, or what I assumed was the face, had no features, just smooth blackness. It looked at me, or at least turned toward me, and a voice filled my head, clear as if someone were speaking directly into my brain. Do not be alarmed. You are unharmed. Yeah, I can see that, I blurted. Sarcasm apparently is my default even under threat of dissection. Nothing says unharmed like yanking someone out of their yard without consent. The alien tilted its head, almost like a dog hearing a strange noise, then spoke again. You are a sample. Analysis is required. Sample? Buddy, I'm not an Amazon return. The other alien, slightly shorter but bulkier, with limbs like an insect's exoskeleton, approached, carrying something that looked a lot like a scalpel. If scalpels came in 3 parts and vibrated. It didn't even try for pleasantries. It pressed the blade to my shoulder, and I howled. Not in pain, at least not physical, but in a sound that ripped through my thoughts. They weren't cutting my flesh. They were cutting into my mind. Images flashed. Moments I barely remembered. A spelling bee I won in 3rd grade. My first failed attempt to ask someone to prom. The time I accidentally set the toaster on fire trying to melt marshmallows. Each memory felt like it was being yanked out, examined, then tossed aside. Stop it! I screamed, but my voice barely echoed in the chamber. The taller alien responded. Your species' resilience is sufficient. Behavioral anomalies detected. Behavioral anomalies? I shouted. I cried during Homeward Bound. That doesn't make me an anomaly. The shorter alien finally spoke, or at least communicated, but its tone was harsher, angrier, like static interrupting a bad signal. "You are defective. Others will replace." I didn't like the sound of replace. Before I could overthink it, I lunged, swiping at the shorter alien with pure, stupid adrenaline. My hand connected with its strange scalpel, sending it flying across the chamber. The taller alien responded instantly, extending its unnervingly long arms to pin me. Except I wasn't having it. I twisted, bringing one knee up into what I prayed was its weak spot. It crumpled slightly but didn't let go. "You will not interfere," it declared, its voice pressing into my skull like a migraine. "Yeah? Watch me," I spat. The chamber shifted suddenly, lurching sideways as if the entire ship had been struck. Alarms blared, a sound more grating than any fire drill I'd ever suffered. The shorter alien hissed something incomprehensible, rushing toward a panel covered in glowing symbols. That's when I spotted them. Cages. Lining the wall behind me were dozens of transparent containers, each filled with human bodies, limp but breathing. Some were kids, others elderly, most somewhere in between. My stomach twisted. These weren't just samples. These were people. "Release them!" I yelled, yanking against the taller alien's grip. It ignored me, focused on whatever crisis the ship was facing. The moment its grip slackened, I bolted toward the cages, searching for any way to open them. My hands fumbled against a panel covered in alien symbols, slapping buttons wildly. I must have hit the right one, because the cages hissed open, and bodies started sliding out to act like they'd been spit up by the machine. Not all of them woke up. The ones that did stared at me, their eyes wide and unfocused, as if their minds hadn't fully reconnected to their bodies. One man, a middle-aged guy with a scraggly beard, grabbed my arm and muttered, "Where? What?" "No time," I barked. "We're getting out of here." The shorter alien screeched, a sound so high-pitched it felt like my skull might split. It lunged toward us. But this time, I was ready. Grabbing the closest thing I could, a chunk of metallic tubing, I swung it with everything I had. The impact sent the alien staggering backward, black ichor dripping from what I assumed was its arm. "Move," I shouted, shoving the freed captives toward what looked like an exit. The taller alien intercepted us, its limbs extending unnaturally to block the path. The shorter one was recovering, its vibrating blade back in hand. Desperation kicked in. I didn't have a plan. Just raw panic and the kind of reckless courage that comes from having absolutely nothing to lose. I hurled the tubing at the taller alien, then dove toward the control panel where the shorter one had been working. Symbols glowed and flickered, and I jabbed at them, praying I wasn't about to blow us all to smithereens. The ship jolted violently, tilting us sideways. The shorter alien screeched again, its blades skittering across the floor. One of the freed captives, a wiry teenager, grabbed the weapon and drove it into the alien's chest. Black liquid sprayed. The creature collapsed, twitching. "Gross," the kid muttered, tossing the blade aside. The taller alien turned toward the chaos, momentarily distracted. I seized the chance, slamming another button on the panel. A hatch opened behind us, revealing a tunnel of blinding white light. "Run!" I screamed. We dove through, one by one, tumbling onto cold, rocky ground. Behind us, the ship shuddered, emitting a deafening hum, before it shot skyward, vanishing into the night. We weren't alone. Bodies littered the forest clearing, some mangled beyond recognition, others eerily pristine. The survivors stared in stunned silence, the weight of what we had just escaped sinking in. Later, investigators swarmed the area, documenting the carnage. Autopsies revealed surgical scars and strange metallic implants in the deceased. Authorities claimed it was a cult gone wrong, a mass delusion fueled by hysteria. They didn't believe us. But I saw the symbols, the cages, the ichor-stained blade. And I know this. Whatever those things were, they weren't done collecting. My name is Kevin Scott. I'm 31 years old, and I swear to God, everything I'm about to tell you is real. It happened 2 years ago in the middle of Green Swamp Wilderness Preserve, Florida. I wish I had listened to the warning. It started as a weekend trip, just 4 of us. Me, my old Army buddy Travis, my best friend Ryan, and his girlfriend Jessie. Ryan was obsessed with urban legends, always chasing cryptid stories and internet horror nonsense. He had been talking for weeks about La Bruja, a swamp witch that supposedly haunted the backwoods of Florida, stealing souls and driving people insane. I should have told him to shut up and pick a normal vacation spot. We set off in Travis's beat-up RV, a clunky relic that rattled like a tin can every time we hit a pothole. The trip was supposed to be fun. Campfires, fishing, and beers under the stars. Just some time away from the city. Instead, it became the worst night of my life. The first sign of trouble came before we even got there. At a gas station just outside the swamp, an old man sitting on the porch stared at us like we were already dead. He spat into a tin cup and said, "Y'all ain't got no business out there." Ryan, grinning like an idiot, asked if he believed in the stories. The old man's face darkened. Once you hear the singing, it's already too late. Travis laughed it off. Jessie rolled her eyes. I felt something tighten in my chest. We drove into the wilderness, deeper than I liked. No cell signal, no GPS. After a while, just miles of swamp, trees like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. It was nearly sunset when we finally parked the RV in a clearing by the water. The first thing I noticed? The silence. No birds, no bugs, not even the hum of mosquitoes. Just dead air, thick with humidity and something I couldn't name. We set up a fire, cooked some canned chili, and cracked open a few beers. The tension eased. Even I started to relax. Then, just after midnight, Ryan disappeared. I woke up to Jessie shaking me. "Kevin, Scott's gone." The fire was just smoldering embers, casting long shadows on the trees. Travis sat up, groggy, rubbing his face. We found Ryan's boots and clothes neatly folded on a log near the water. His camera was still there, turned off. No tracks leading away. No sound. Jessie panicked. "We need to look for him, now." "Hell no," I said. "We wait until morning. We don't go into the swamp at night." But she wasn't listening. She grabbed a flashlight and stormed off. Travis and I had no choice but to follow. The deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. The trees started to look the same, like we were walking in circles. My watch said 2:14 a.m., but the moon hadn't moved. Then we heard it, a woman humming, soft, eerie, like an old lullaby. Travis froze. "That ain't Jessie." The light from Jessie's flashlight flickered in the distance. She screamed. We ran toward her, found her standing in a knee-deep pool of water, shaking. I saw him. "Ryan?" She nodded. "He was standing right there. But his eyes were black, pitch black. He smiled at me." I turned my flashlight on the water. Nothing, just ripples. Travis grabbed my arm. "Kevin," I turned. A woman was standing in the trees. She was impossibly tall, skin stretched tight over her bones. Her face was wrong, her mouth too wide, her fingers too long, and her eyes, black pits. Empty. She smiled. The flashlight died. Something yanked Travis into the water. He screamed, thrashing as unseen hands pulled him under. I lunged, grabbed his arm. Jessie screamed beside me. I pulled hard. Something let go. Travis gasped, coughing up swamp water, but his back was covered in deep claw marks, bleeding through his shirt. We ran. Somehow, we made it back to the RV. We barricaded ourselves inside, locked the doors, closed the curtains. Jessie sobbed. Travis groaned in pain. I checked the gashes on his back. They weren't just wounds. They were symbols. Then Ryan knocked on the door. Jessie moved to unlock it, but I grabbed her wrist. "Look at his eyes," I whispered. Through the window, I saw him standing in the moonlight, smiling. Too wide, his black eyes gleaming. "Let me in, guys," he said. His voice layered. His and something else. Jessie broke. "It's him. We have to let him in." Travis, still weak, just muttered, Don't. I grabbed my knife. Ryan kept knocking, louder, then pounding. I stepped forward, gripping the handle, my heart slamming in my chest. Then Ryan stopped. Silence. I peeked out the window. Gone. We didn't sleep. Every few minutes, I swore I heard whispering outside, soft laughter, scratching on the walls. Around dawn, Jessie had had enough. She grabbed a backpack. "I'm going for help." I grabbed her arm. "No, you're not." She shook me off. "I can't stay in here, Kevin. I can't." She ran outside before I could stop her. She screamed. I bolted after her. Nothing. Just her flashlight on the ground. She was gone. Vanished. Travis and I sat there in stunned silence. I wanted to cry, to scream, but I couldn't. Then Ryan came back. He walked right out of the trees, smiling, naked except for his jeans. His eyes, normal again. His voice, his own. "What's wrong?" he asked. "You guys look like you've seen a ghost." Travis whispered, No. I clenched my knife. "Where's Jessie?" Ryan tilted his head. "Who's Jessie?" My stomach dropped. Travis lost it. He grabbed a tire iron and swung at Ryan, but Ryan moved too fast, too fluid. He caught the iron mid-swing. Smiled. "Don't do that, buddy." I grabbed Travis and dragged him back toward the RV. We locked the door, boarded up the windows with what little we had left. Ryan sat outside, just sat there, smiling, and night fell again. Travis stopped responding. He was burning up, feverish, and then the humming started again. Ryan started laughing. I heard Jesse's voice whisper through the walls. "Kevin, let me in." I closed my eyes, held my breath. At some point, Travis stopped breathing. Morning came. Ryan was gone. Travis was cold. I didn't wait any longer. I ran through the swamp, not stopping, not caring what was behind me. I ran until I saw a road. A trucker found me, half crazed, covered in mud and blood. They never found Travis's body, or Jesse's. They did find the RV, though. The doors ripped off. The inside, covered in deep claw marks. And Ryan? He was on the news a week later, found wandering near the swamp. No memory of what happened. He doesn't remember me. But sometimes I wake up at night and I hear the humming. My name is Timothy Perez, and in 2015, I ventured to Royale in Michigan to escape the bustle of city life. I'd always been the kind of guy who preferred the whisper of the trees over the honking of horns, and this remote island seemed like the perfect getaway. I arrived on a chilly morning, the kind where your breath fogs up like a bad magic trick. The ferry ride over Lake Superior was uneventful, save for an older gentleman who warned me about the island's unpredictable weather. "If you don't like it," he chuckled, "just wait 6 minutes." I laughed it off, thinking I'd heard that joke in every town I'd ever visited. Royale was everything I hoped it would be. Dense forests, crystal clear lakes, and trails that seemed to stretch on forever. I set up camp near Rock Harbor, not far from where the ferry had dropped me off. The plan was simple. Hike, take photos, and maybe find some inspiration for the novel I'd been pretending to write for years. You know, the one where the hero saves the world and gets the girl, all while maintaining perfect hair. On my second day, I met a group of hikers, Tom, Lisa, and their teenage son, Max. They were from Chicago and had that Midwestern friendliness that makes you feel like you've known them for years. We exchanged pleasantries, and they invited me to join them for dinner at their campsite. Never one to turn down free food, especially when my options were dwindling packets of instant noodles, I gladly accepted. As we sat around the campfire that evening, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories, Tom shared tales about the island's wildlife. "They say the wolves here are some of the most elusive creatures you'll never see," he said, poking the fire with a stick. "Maybe they're just introverted," I quipped. "Can't blame them for wanting some peace and quiet." Max rolled his eyes. "Dad thinks every rustle in the bushes is a wolf waiting to pounce." "Better safe than sorry," Lisa interjected, smiling warmly. The night sky was a canvas of stars, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Little did I know that would be the last time things felt normal. The next morning, we decided to hike together to Mount Ojibwe, one of the island's higher points, promising breathtaking views. As we trekked through the forest, conversations flowed easily. Max complained about not having seltzers. Tom told another one of his infamous dad jokes. "Why don't oysters donate to charity?" "Because they're shellfish." And Lisa kept us all in line with her motherly charm. About halfway up, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned ranger station. It looked like it hadn't seen maintenance since flip phones were cutting-edge technology. Curious, we decided to take a look inside. The door creaked ominously. Classic horror movie stuff, I know. The interior was sparse. A broken chair, a desk with outdated maps, and a musty smell that could have been bottled and sold as ode to neglect. Max found a faded journal tucked in a drawer. Flipping through it, his face paled. "Listen to this," he said. June 5th, 1998, sightings of an unknown animal have increased. Rangers advised to travel in pairs. 2 hikers reported missing. "Probably just old campfire stories," I suggested, trying to lighten the mood. "Or maybe the previous ranger had an overactive imagination." Tom shrugged. "Still, maybe we should stick together. Safety in numbers, right?" We continued our hike, but the atmosphere had shifted. The forest seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. Even the birds had ceased their chatter. I joked that they must be on a union-mandated break, but no one laughed. Reaching the summit, The view was as spectacular as promised. Lake Superior stretched out endlessly, its waters glistening under the midday sun. We ate lunch in relative silence, the earlier unease still lingering. On our way back, we noticed something odd. The forest floor, which had been carpeted with leaves and twigs, now showed signs of disturbance. Deep gashes marred the trees, and patches of ground looked as though they'd been clawed by something large. Probably a bear, Tom speculated, though his voice lacked conviction. Do bears even live on this island? Lisa asked, her eyes wide. Mostly wolves and moose, I replied, but I've never heard of moose doing this. Max snapped a few pictures. Maybe we'll go viral, he said, attempting a grin. Teen documents mysterious forest creature. Click here to find out what happens next. Let's keep moving, Tom suggested, picking up the pace. As we neared the split where we'd go our separate ways, me back to Rock Harbor, them to their campsite, Tom placed a hand on my shoulder. You sure you don't want to join us for dinner again? I smiled. Thanks, but I think I'll turn in early tonight. Besides, I can't mooch off you guys forever. Lisa handed me a walkie-talkie. Just in case. Channel 6. We'd feel better knowing we can reach you. I accepted it gratefully. Thanks. I'll be fine. What's the worst that could happen? We parted ways, and I headed back to my tent. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that danced eerily among the trees. I told myself I was being ridiculous. After all, I came here to escape stress, not invent new reasons for it. Settling into my tent, I decided to review the photos I had taken. Scrolling through the images, one caught my eye. It was from the summit, a panoramic shot. But there, among the trees, was a dark shape that hadn't been there before. Zooming in didn't help. It only made the image grainier. Probably just a trick of the light, I muttered. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. Nothing out of the ordinary. I crawled into my sleeping bag, grateful for its warmth. Sometime later, I awoke to a faint crackling sound. At first, I thought it was rain, but the sky had been clear. Then I smelled it. Smoke. Unzipping my tent, I peeked outside to see a small fire burning near the tree line. That's not supposed to be there, I thought. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously approached. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a random blaze. It was a campfire. Around it lay scattered belongings. A backpack, a hat, a hiking boot. No signs of people, though. Hello? I called out. Anyone there? Silence. I noticed the backpack had a name tag, Kevin Moore. Rifling through it seemed invasive, but I was concerned someone might be hurt. Inside, I found the usual, water bottle, trail mix, a map, but also a journal. Flipping it open, the last entry read, "Something is following me. I can hear it at night. If anyone finds this." A chill ran down my spine. Not the figurative kind people write about, but a genuine, icy dread. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. I decided to head back to my tent when the radio crackled. Just then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, echoing through the forest. It was human, filled with terror, and abruptly cut off. I sprinted back to my campsite, hands shaking as I fumbled with the walkie-talkie. Tom, Lisa, do you copy? Tom? Max? Anyone? Finally, a crackling response. Timothy, what's going on? I heard a scream near my camp. Found someone's gear, but no person. Something's not right. Stay put. We're on our way, Tom replied. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. I kept the flashlight beam moving, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, in the periphery of the light, I saw it. A massive silhouette lurking between the trees. It moved with a fluidity that was unnerving for something its size. I pointed the flashlight directly at it. The creature resembled a wolf, but stood upright like a human. Its fur was a mottled mix of grays and blacks. Its snout was elongated, teeth glinting as it snarled, eyes fixed on me. It let out a sound that was somewhere between a howl and a roar. My mind raced. This can't be real, I thought. Did someone spike my trail mix? Fight or flight kicked in, and flight won by a landslide. I bolted in the direction I hoped was toward Tom and Lisa. Behind me, I heard the creature crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground despite my adrenaline-fueled sprint. Ahead, I saw the beam of another flashlight. Timothy, Perez's voice shouted. Run, I yelled. Go back. But it was too late. The creature lunged between us, grabbing Max with clawed hands. He screamed as it dragged him into the darkness. Max! Lisa shrieked, dropping to her knees. Tom grabbed her arm. We have to move! I stood there, paralyzed by shock. Tom shook me. Timothy, we need to get to safety now. We stumbled through the forest, the creature's guttural sounds echoing behind us. Reaching a rocky outcrop, we wedged ourselves into a narrow crevice. The creature couldn't fit but clawed at the entrance, its razor-like nails scraping against the stone. Lisa was sobbing uncontrollably. Tom held her, his face a mask of despair. "We have to do something," I whispered. "And what do you suggest?" Tom snapped. "Offered a s'more?" Despite the dire situation, a hysterical laugh bubbled up. "I always knew camping was a bad idea," I muttered. "Next time, I'm sticking to Netflix and chill." "Assuming there is a next time," Tom retorted. Hours seemed to pass as we huddled together. The creature eventually retreated, but we could hear it pacing nearby, waiting. "We can't stay here forever," Lisa whispered. "At dawn, we'll make a run for the ranger station," Tom decided. "Assuming that place is still standing," I added. Morning light filtered in, and the forest took on an almost serene appearance, betraying the horrors of the night. We cautiously emerged, every snap of a twig making us jump. The trek to the ranger station was tense but uneventful. When we arrived, the place looked as abandoned as before, but it was our only hope. Inside, we found an old radio. Tom fiddled with it. Come on, he urged. Static." Then a voice. "This is Ranger Dispatch. Identify yourself." "Help, we're at the old ranger station on Royale. Something attacked us. Our friend is missing," Tom blurted out. "Stay where you are. We're dispatching a team," the voice replied. Hours passed, each minute stretching longer than the last. Suddenly, the door burst open. Not rescuers, the creature. It had tracked us. It lunged at Tom, who tried to fend it off with a rusted fire poker. "Get Lisa out of here," he shouted. I grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her toward the back door. "We can't leave him," she protested. "We don't have a choice." As we stumbled outside, a gunshot rang out. Startled, we turned to see Tom standing over the creature, a flare gun in his hands. The beast writhed on the floor, momentarily incapacitated. "Didn't think that would actually work," Tom said, breathing heavily. We didn't waste time celebrating. Together, we ran toward the shoreline, hoping to signal any passing boats. Reaching the water's edge, we waved frantically as a ferry appeared in the distance. Behind us, the creature emerged once more, smoke still rising from its singed fur. It was wounded but relentless. "Keep going," Tom urged. As the ferry drew closer, a group of park rangers aboard spotted us. And the creature. They shouted orders we couldn't make out, but their raised rifles were a welcome sight. A volley of shots rang out. The creature let out a final, agonized howl before collapsing. The rangers escorted us onto the ferry. One of them, a stern-looking woman named Officer Delgado, questioned us about the incident. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "We've had reports of missing hikers, but nothing concrete until now." "What was that thing?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Delgado exchanged glances with her team. "We've got some theories, but nothing official. The island has its secrets." Back on the mainland, we gave our statements to the authorities. They assured us they'd investigate further, but something in their eyes told me they weren't expecting to find anything. A week later, news reports surfaced about the discovery of remains on Royale, bones that didn't quite match any known species. Experts were baffled, speculating everything from undiscovered wildlife to elaborate hoaxes. As for Max, he was never found. A memorial service was held, but closure remained elusive. In the end, the island was closed to the public indefinitely. Official statements cited environmental concerns, but we knew better. I returned to city life, as the noise and crowds now a strange comfort. Occasionally, I'd catch myself scanning the headlines, looking for any mention of unexplained events in remote places. One day, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a journal, the same one I'd found at the abandoned camp. How it got to me, I had no idea. Attached was a note. "Thought you might want this, Officer Delgado." Flipping through the pages, I noticed new entries in handwriting that wasn't mine. They detailed sightings of creatures across various national parks, all eerily similar to what we'd encountered. It seemed the island wasn't the only place hiding secrets. I closed the journal and stared out the window at the cityscape. Maybe isolation wasn't the escape I thought it would be. My name is Austin Gibson. I'm 42 years old, and I swear on everything I have left that what happened in Appalachian National Forest was real. I don't drink anymore. I can't, because every time I do, I see that thing's face grinning back at me in the dark. I drove my old RV into the forest a few years ago, thinking I needed some time alone after the divorce. I wasn't sleeping much. My hands shook if I wasn't holding a beer. My ex-wife Lisa said I needed help, but what I needed was space. Silence. So I packed up took a few cases of whiskey, and drove out to the deepest part of Appalachian, where no one would bother me. The road was bad, worse than I expected. The deeper I went, the more the trees closed in, thick moss hanging from the branches like dead fingers. I didn't see another car for miles. That's how I wanted it. Just me, the swamp, and enough liquor to make me forget why I was out there in the first place. I found a clearing near the water and parked. No cell service, no radio reception, just the sound of frogs and the occasional rustling in the brush. The air was thick, humid as hell, and the sun was already sinking. The first thing that went wrong was the RV's battery. I killed the engine, went outside to take a leak, and when I came back, the lights wouldn't turn on. No power, no reason for it either. The damn thing had been fine all the way there. I figured I'd deal with it in the morning. That night, I sat by the fire, drinking, trying not to think about Lisa or the divorce, or the fact that I had nowhere to go when I got back. Then the knocking started. Soft, like fingertips against the metal. I turned my head slowly toward the RV. Nothing. Probably a branch, I told myself. Or an animal. I went inside, locking the door behind me. I lay down on the small cot, listening. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. It was coming from the other side now, near the back window. I grabbed my flashlight and yanked open the curtain. Nothing but darkness. I shut the curtain, turned over, and tried to sleep. At some point in the night, the radio turned on. It hadn't worked in years. The damn thing was busted, fried from an old battery issue. But now it crackled with static. And through it, a song started playing. Lisa used to love that song. But the lyrics were wrong. The voice singing was off, slow, stretched, like someone mimicking a record player at half speed. I yanked the power knob. The music stopped. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went outside to check the engine. That's when I saw the footprints. Not mine. They circled the RV, stopping right outside my window. Bare footprints, too long, like the toes had been stretched out. I told myself it was some local screwing with me, someone trying to scare me off. I decided I'd had enough of that spot, so I packed up to leave. Got in the driver's seat, turned the key. Nothing. The RV wouldn't start. I opened the hood, checked the wires. Everything looked fine, but it was like the engine was just dead, like the damn thing had given up. I was stuck. That's when I saw the man in the trees, far off, just standing between the pines, his head tilted, watching me. I called out, but he didn't move. I took a step forward. "Hey, buddy, you lost?" He took a step back, fading into the shadows. I ran toward where he had been, but by the time I got there, the trees were empty. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. I went back to camp, locking myself in the RV even though I knew that wouldn't do much. I spent the rest of the day trying to fix the engine, trying to find some rational explanation. Then the knocking came back. But this time, it was coming from the door. I froze. Knock, knock, knock. I swallowed hard, gripping the handle of my knife. Who's there? Silence. Then a voice. Low calm. "Danny." My breath hitched. "Lisa." I backed away from the door. The handle rattled. "Danny, let me in." My hands shook. My head felt light. I hadn't spoken to Lisa in weeks. She wasn't here. She couldn't be here. I peeked out the window. She was standing there. Lisa, in the blue dress she wore the night she left me. Her hair down. Her lips curled in that soft little smile she used to give me when we were happy. I squeezed my eyes shut. I was hallucinating. The booze, the stress, that was all it was. When I opened my eyes, she was closer, right outside the window, smiling, too wide, her lips curled back, revealing too many teeth. I screamed and threw myself back. The knocking stopped. I didn't open the door. I didn't sleep. The next day, I tried to hike out. No matter how far I walked, I always ended up back at the RV. By sunset, I was losing my mind. Then the park ranger showed up. He came walking down the path like nothing was wrong, clipboard in hand. "You lost, sir?" I ran up to him. "Jesus, man, you gotta help me. My RV's dead. Then I saw his badge. Holloway, my last name. I stepped back. "What the hell?" He just smiled. "You're not supposed to be here, Danny." I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, but no matter which way I went, I always ended up back at that damn RV. That night, the radio came on again. This time, it wasn't music. It was a voice, deep, laughing. "You're almost ready to let go." I covered my ears. "Shut up, shut the hell up." The mirror in the RV cracked, and my own face smiled back at me. "Danny," it whispered, "you know why she left." I backed away, shaking. No, 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 no. You were driving drunk. The air went out of my lungs. You crashed." I shook my head. "No, no, she left me." My reflection grinned wider. She didn't leave. She never left. And then I remembered. The rain that night, the headlights spinning, the crunch of metal. I never called the cops. I passed out, woke up in the wreckage, stumbled home, convinced myself she'd just left. But she was still out there, somewhere in the swamp, buried. I fell to my knees, my head in my hands. The voice whispered in my ear, "You can stay here, Danny, or you can let go." I don't know what made me do it, but I grabbed the bottle of whiskey and smashed it against the RV's floor. I lit a match. The fire spread fast. The voice screamed. The last thing I saw before I passed out, Lisa, standing in the flames, smiling. I woke up on the side of the road. My truck was there. The road was dry. The sky was clear. I drove out of that forest and never looked back. But sometimes, at night, I hear the knocking, and when I look in the mirror, I see my own face, smiling back. My name is Randy Smith, and back in 2018, I decided to take my RV up to Lake Superior Provincial Park in Ontario for some peace and quiet. Being cooped up in the city was starting to make me feel like a sardine in a can, and I figured some fresh air might do me good. Besides, I've always believed that nature and I have an understanding. I don't bother it, and it doesn't bother me. I've never been the rugged outdoorsman type. My idea of hiking involves a well-marked trail and a picnic at the end. But the allure of the open road and the promise of solitude were too tempting to pass up. So I packed my essentials, a week's worth of snacks, a stack of books I'd been meaning to read, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. The drive was picturesque, with the trees flaunting their autumn colors like they were showing off. By the time I reached the park, the sun was casting golden hues over the lake, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I found a secluded spot near the water, set up camp, and made myself a cup of coffee. This isn't so bad, I thought. Maybe I should write a book, Randy's Adventures in the Wild. As dusk settled, I decided to light a campfire. There's something hypnotic about watching flames dance. It's like nature's television. I was roasting marshmallows, because what's a camping trip without s'mores? When I heard footsteps crunching leaves behind me. "Evening," a voice said. I turned to see a man standing at the edge of my campsite. He was tall and gaunt, with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they'd been through a war zone. His eyes had a peculiar glint, one that made me instinctively uneasy. "Evening," I replied cautiously. "Can I help you with something?" "Just passing through," he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Jedediah, but folks call me Jed." "Randy," I offered, though he hadn't asked. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" He stepped closer, eyeing the marshmallows. "Sure is. Mind if I join you for a bit?" Every alarm bell in my head was ringing, but I didn't want to be rude. Actually, I was just about to turn in, long drive and all. He tilted his head, the smile fading. "Fair enough. You take care now." "Will do," I said, watching as he disappeared into the shadows. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Well, that wasn't creepy at all," I muttered, deciding it was indeed time to call it a night. I extinguished the fire and secured the RV. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of pine. I convinced myself that I'd overreacted the night before. Maybe Jed was just a harmless drifter. After breakfast, I decided to explore a nearby trail. I left a note on the dashboard, a habit from watching too many true crime shows, grabbed my backpack, and set off. The trail was serene, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and leaves crunching underfoot. I was about an hour in when I noticed something odd, a campsite just off the path. But it looked abandoned. Curious, I ventured closer. Tents were collapsed, and belongings were strewn about as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Unease settled in my stomach. This is how people end up in horror movies, I joked nervously to myself. I decided to head back. As I turned, I nearly bumped into Jed. "Whoa, you startled me," I exclaimed. "Sorry about that," he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "What brings you here?" Just hiking, I replied, trying to sound casual. You? Same, he said, his gaze fixed on me. Shame about what happened here. Yeah, looks like they left in a hurry, he chuckled softly. Or something made them leave. I swallowed hard. Well, I should get going. Don't let me keep you, he said, stepping aside. I walked briskly back to the trail, feeling his eyes on me the whole time. By the time I reached my RV, my heart was pounding. Maybe it's time to move on to another site, I thought. I started packing up when I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, half expecting Jed, but it was another man, this one wearing a park ranger uniform. Sorry to startle you, he said. I'm Ranger Thompson, just making my rounds. Oh, thank goodness, I sighed in relief. Randy Farnsworth. Everything all right? You look a bit shaken. I debated whether to mention Jed, but decided I might sound paranoid. Just had an odd encounter earlier. Do you know a man named Jedediah around here? The ranger's expression darkened. Jedediah Clark? Yeah, goes by Jed. He nodded grimly. We've had reports about him. I'd advise you to be cautious. He's not well. Not well how? I pressed. Look, it's probably best if you relocate to a more populated area of the park, he suggested. Safety in numbers. Understood, I said, feeling a knot in my stomach. Thanks for the warning. As he left, I hurried to finish packing. Just as I was about to start the engine, I realized I'd left my map on the picnic table. I stepped out to grab it, when something heavy struck me from behind. Everything went black. I awoke to a splitting headache and found myself tied to a chair inside what looked like an old cabin. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern, casting eerie shadows on the walls adorned with hunting trophies. Rise and shine, came Jed's voice from the darkness. What do you want? I demanded, struggling against the ropes. He stepped into the light, a sinister smile playing on his lips. Company. Is that too much to ask? Kidnapping isn't exactly the way to make friends, I retorted. He laughed. Oh, but we're past pleasantries now. Look, if it's money you want. Money? He interrupted. You think this is about money? No, all this is about survival. Survival? He began pacing. City folks like you come here thinking you own the place, leaving your trash, making noise, disrupting the balance. I'm sorry if I... Too late for apologies, he snapped. You and your kind are a blight. You're not making any sense, I said, trying to keep him talking while I worked at the knots. He pulled out a hunting knife, examining it thoughtfully. Sense? Sense is living off the land, respecting its laws, not hiding in metal boxes on wheels. Okay, noted. I'll just be on my way and promise to leave nature untouched, I said. He shook his head slowly. Can't let you do that. Before I could respond, there was a loud bang on the door. Jedediah Clark, this is Ranger Thompson. Open up! Jed's eyes flickered with rage. You just couldn't stay quiet, could you? As he moved toward the door, adrenaline surged through me. I managed to loosen the ropes enough to free one hand. Without thinking, I grabbed a heavy wooden stool and waited. As Jed turned back, I swung with all my might. The stool connected with his shoulder, causing him to drop the knife and stumble. You little, he growled. I didn't wait for him to finish. I bolted for the back door, bursting into the cool night air. My RV was parked nearby, and I sprinted toward it, fumbling with the keys. As I jumped inside and started the engine, I saw Jed appear in the side mirror, fury etched on his face. I didn't look back. Later, I learned that Jed had been evading capture for months. He was a former survivalist who lost his grip on reality after a tragic accident claimed his family. As for me, next time someone suggests a nature trip, I'll politely decline. I'm outdoorsy, in that I like having drinks on patios. My name is Austin Gibson, and this happened back in 2011 in Shawnee National Forest, Illinois, when I first took a temporary ranger job there to help with the busy fall season. Never suspecting I'd leave that place with shaking hands and a heart full of questions. I remember stepping into that small ranger station around late September, feeling pretty good because I'd managed to snag a cheap motel room in town that morning. I had a bland cheese sandwich for breakfast, just something out of the convenience store freezer section, and washed it down with watery coffee. I wore a faded uniform passed down from a previous hire who'd left mustard stains near the left pocket. It smelled like stale sweat and cheap detergent, but I was just glad to have work. I was 25, broke, and eager to prove myself reliable. I liked the quiet of the forest trails, the dense maples and oaks, and the smell of damp leaves after last week's rain. We had a small team, just me and two others on rotation that day. Tom, older and with a bushy beard that he tied with a rubber band, always joked about his ex-wife and how her new husband sold fancy lawnmowers. And Gina, in her early 40s, usually wore a baseball cap over short-cropped hair. She had a habit of humming some old tune I couldn't place whenever she got nervous. She'd say, "Pat, you know that feeling when you think the woods are just a bit too still?" I didn't know what she meant back then. I thought forests were supposed to be quiet. That morning, Gina handed me a radio and said, "Don't wander off without checking in. It's not summer camp season, but we still get the odd hiker." By noon, I was on a trail known as Pine Hollow Path, which, despite the name, had more oaks than pines. The canopy let through thin beams of light, and the forest floor was scattered with red and brown leaves. I came across a half-eaten energy bar wrapper on the path, which struck me as odd because we usually lectured visitors about leaving no trash. I stuffed it in my pocket. About an hour later, I stumbled on something far more disturbing, a torn jacket sleeve snagged on a low branch. It looked recent, maybe a day old, and the fabric was stiff with something dark. I didn't want to think about it. That's when I radioed Tom. "Hey, found a torn piece of clothing. Could be a lost hiker. Anything on the logs?" Tom answered with a yawn. "We had a party of 3 who checked in yesterday. They should have been out by now." That sent a chill into my chest, and I began scanning the underbrush with more care. I followed a faint trail of broken twigs and disturbed leaves off the main path. About 20 feet in, I smelled something unpleasant, like old meat left out on a warm countertop. I advanced slowly, heart tapping at my ribs. In a small clearing behind a fallen tree, I found the body of a man. He looked about 40, wearing a hiking vest and boots. His left arm lay twisted at a strange angle, and part of his torso had been torn open. The sight made my stomach lurch. I stepped back, pressed my hand against my mouth, and tried to breathe through it. Then I spoke into the radio with forced calm. "Tom," I said, "I've got a deceased male hiker here. Looks like an animal attack." Gina broke in, her voice uneasy. "Animal attacks are rare here. Are you sure?" I didn't answer her. I just gave them my coordinates. While I waited, I squatted down, thinking maybe the poor guy slipped and got mauled by a coyote or something. But coyotes don't usually leave bodies like that. I took in the surroundings, noticing deep scratches on a nearby tree trunk, higher than my shoulders. There was a pattern, something I couldn't quite place. But it definitely wasn't from a raccoon or a bobcat. When Tom and Gina arrived, they were both grim-faced. Tom tried to hide his shock. Gina stopped humming. She just stared and shook her head. We decided to search for the other 2 hikers from that party of 3. Tom radioed the station to call for authorities. We couldn't just leave, not with the possibility of survivors. We moved deeper into the woods, spreading out but staying close enough to yell if something happened. I remember wiping sweat off my forehead, even though it wasn't that hot. The silence weighed on me. Sometimes a branch cracked underfoot, and I jumped. Then we found another body. This time, it was a woman, slumped against a boulder. Her pack was gone, her face frozen in a look of pain. She had similar wounds, and the ground around her was stained and scattered with damp leaves. I wish I hadn't eaten that cheese sandwich earlier. "Hello? Anybody out here?" I called. No answer. I heard Tom whisper, "This is bad, Pat." I nodded, my mouth dry. Gina, who walked a short distance away, suddenly shouted, "Found footprints!" We hurried over. There were large impressions in the soft earth, bigger than any mountain lion print I'd seen in guides. They looked like a cat's, but heavier. Deeper. "A cougar?" Tom asked. Gina shrugged. "Not impossible, but..." She trailed off. Something about these tracks bothered her. They showed long strides, more powerful than what we expected. We decided to keep searching for the 3rd hiker. The afternoon light was fading, and we had to use flashlights. Being out there as dusk approached set me on edge. I found myself talking just to break the tension. "Tom, remember that big raccoon we saw by the dumpsters yesterday?" Tom grunted. I tried a lame joke. "If that raccoon shows up now, I'll offer him my last candy bar to watch our backs." No one laughed. Then, at twilight, we heard a scream, quick and sharp. We ran toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks. We found the third hiker, alive at first. A young guy in his 20s, holding his side, crouched under a half-fallen tree. "Help!" he shouted, voice cracking. We rushed over, flashlights jumping. He looked terrified, eyes darting behind us as if expecting something to pounce. "It took them. It's out here." He didn't have to say more. We heard heavy steps in the brush, a soft rustling that made my skin prickle. We formed a semicircle around the wounded hiker, shining our beams into the dark trees. I saw a shape then, low and muscular, moving between trunks. No distinct silhouette, just movement. My heart thundered. Then it rushed forward. I could barely describe its form. A cat-like body, maybe 5 feet long, thick shoulders, dark fur that blended with the night. It moved quietly, at first. Then, thump! It slammed into the injured hiker. He screamed. We shouted, shining lights into its face. I saw powerful jaws flash open and close. The man's screams turned into choking gasps. I stepped forward, but Tom grabbed my shoulder. "Pat, no! It's too late." Gina swung her flashlight at the creature's head, and it hissed, a strange, sharp sound. Then it ran off into the darkness, leaving the man on the ground. He was gone. And that was only the beginning. We knelt beside him. He was gone. It had ended his life in seconds. Gina cursed under her breath. Tom looked like he might cry. I felt sick again, kneeling there, trying to hold my flashlight steady. Now we had 3 dead hikers, a killer animal somewhere in the woods, and night pressing in on all sides. We made a plan to retreat to the station. The radio crackled as we tried to call for backup. Spotty reception. "We need the phone," I said. Tom nodded. We hurried back along the trail, our flashlights bouncing over tree trunks and roots. Gina whispered, "Don't run. Running sets it off." We moved briskly but tried to look calm, which was impossible. I gripped my radio so hard my knuckles hurt. Halfway back, we realized something was keeping pace with us. Branches snapped lightly. I tried to catch a glimpse but only saw shifting silhouettes. We picked up speed. "I'll buy us all dinner if we get out of this," I muttered. No one responded. I suppose we all wanted to pretend we were anywhere else, maybe at a diner with French fries and milkshakes, not stuck in the dark with a vicious predator. At one point, Tom lagged behind to catch his breath. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll be right there." Gina and I stopped, turned back. "Don't be stupid," she said. "We stick together." He nodded and lumbered forward, chest heaving. He was bigger than me, maybe 50 pounds heavier, and the fear weighed on him. We formed a tight group, shining lights in every direction. The woods smelled damp and earthy, and every sound set me on edge. We reached a fork in the path. By then, I noticed fresh scratches on the bark of a large oak, long, parallel marks, too clean to be random. We heard a sudden snapping of twigs and spun around. The creature rushed past our lights so fast I barely saw more than a dark shape. Tom shouted, "There!" but it moved in a blur. Gina and I tried to stand back to back with him. We breathed in quick, shallow gasps. I held a length of sturdy branch I'd picked up, though I doubted it would help much. A moment passed, maybe less. Then it struck again, hitting Tom this time. I swung the branch wildly, hitting only air. I saw Tom on the ground, coughing, struggling. Gina screamed at me to help him. I knelt and tried to pull him up. His chest and shoulder were torn, and his hands shook as he reached for me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I tried to stop the bleeding with my jacket, but it was too much. His eyes fluttered. I pleaded, "Come on, Tom. Don't leave me here, man." He said nothing else. Gina stood guard, flashlight shaking in her grip. The forest was too silent again. After a minute, I realized Tom was gone. My eyes stung with tears. I swallowed hard and said, "Gina, we have to run." We ran. I know I said not to run earlier, but we had no choice. Our boots pounded the dirt. The station wasn't far. The creature crashed through the brush behind us, keeping pace. My lungs burned, and my mind spun. I tried to recall if there was a service rifle locked at the station. Maybe. Maybe not. Anything would help. Gina was ahead of me, her flashlight beam shaking. We broke through the last stand of trees and saw the faint light from the station's bulb. I fumbled for the door, keys rattling. Inside, I slammed it shut and pushed a heavy cabinet against it. Gina collapsed into a chair, gasping. "We lost Tom," she said flatly. I nodded, pressing my forehead against the door. We tried the landline phone, static. We tried the radio, no immediate response. Maybe the call had gone out earlier and help was on the way. Maybe not. While Gina searched for a first aid kit, I peered out a small window. Nothing but darkness and the suggestion of trees. I listened hard, hearing only the hum of the station's small fridge. There was a box of flares on a shelf, and I pulled one out, thinking maybe we could signal someone. I waited, half expecting the animal to burst in. But it didn't. Hours passed. Gina stayed quiet. I remember rummaging through a drawer and finding a half-eaten bag of pretzels. My throat was too tight to swallow. As the first hint of dawn broke, we dared to open the door a crack. The forest looked normal, dew on leaves. Pale light filtering through. No sign of the creature. No strange prints by the door. Nothing. We stepped outside, tense, every sense sharpened. We didn't talk about going back to look for the bodies. We just knew we had to get the proper authorities and show them. We found a ranger truck behind the station, old, but it ran. Gina drove while I clutched the flare gun. My hands trembled with every bump in the dirt road. We made it out. But we carried what we saw inside our minds. When the sheriff's deputies and wildlife officers arrived later that day, they searched in teams, rifles ready. They found the bodies. They found unusual tracks. But I never heard a confident explanation. Maybe a rogue predator wandered in from another region. Maybe something escaped from a private collector's estate. I don't know. Gina and I never got a satisfying answer. They patrolled heavily for weeks. Nothing else turned up. Eventually, people said it must have been a one-time tragedy. I still think about it. I still see that creature's eyes in the beam of my flashlight. Sometimes, I wonder if it slipped away to another stretch of forest, still hungry, still waiting to surprise someone. I can't shake that thought. Even today, when I step outside at dusk, I pause and listen harder than I did before, just in case. My name is Logan Cooper, and this happened to me on September 14th, 1994. I've been a search and rescue officer for almost 2 decades now. I've seen a lot, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the fall of '88. It was one of those years when the forest seemed to breathe easier, the air crisp and cool, the leaves transforming into a kaleidoscope of red, orange, and yellow. Most of my days were spent patrolling the trails and helping lost hikers find their way back. It was a job I loved, one that gave me a sense of purpose and connection to nature. It started as a regular Friday. I was in the ranger station, sipping on a cup of coffee, the kind that's more bitter than soothing, when the call came in. A family reported their teenage son missing. They were camping in the dense woods of the Cascade Range, near a spot we locals called Blackwood Hollow. It wasn't a popular area. In fact, it was pretty remote, which made it all the more concerning. The boy, Kyle Thompson, had been missing for nearly 12 hours. I grabbed my gear, radioed my partner Rick, and we headed out. Rick was a good guy, a bit younger than me, with a sharp mind and quick wit. We joked about how every rescue mission felt like we were stepping into an old western, with us as the cowboys riding into the unknown. We reached Blackwood Hollow by late afternoon. The place had an eerie calm to it, a stillness that seemed to swallow sound. We met Kyle's parents at their campsite. They were frantic, the mother on the verge of tears, the father pacing like a caged animal. They explained that Kyle had wandered off the previous night, saying he was going to explore, but he never came back. Rick and I started our search, moving in a grid pattern, calling out Kyle's name. We had a good system, years of experience between us. As dusk settled, the forest grew darker, and our flashlights barely cut through the thickening gloom. There's something about the woods at night that gets under your skin, makes you feel like you're being watched. About an hour in, we found Kyle's backpack. It was lying at the base of a massive oak tree, partially covered in leaves. Inside were typical teenage things: a flashlight, some snacks, a notebook, but no sign of Kyle. We pressed on, our shouts becoming more urgent. Then we heard it, a faint, distant cry. It was hard to pinpoint, but it was there. We followed the sound, moving quickly now, the urgency driving us forward. The cries led us deeper into the forest, to a part I wasn't familiar with. The trees were denser, the path narrower. It felt like we were being funneled into a trap. We came upon a clearing, and there, in the middle, was a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, windows shattered, roof caved in. The cries were louder now, coming from inside. Rick and I exchanged a look. This wasn't right, but we had to find Kyle. We approached the cabin cautiously, flashlight sweeping the area. I called out, "Kyle, you in there?" No response, just the continued whimpering. We pushed the door open and the smell hit us first, damp, rotting wood mixed with something metallic. Blood. Inside, the place was a mess. Furniture overturned, debris everywhere. In the corner, we saw him, Kyle, huddled and trembling, eyes wide with fear. But he wasn't alone. Standing over him was a figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Before we could react, the figure lunged at Rick, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. Rick went down, and I barely had time to draw my knife. I slashed at the figure, connecting with something solid. It hissed, a sound that made my skin crawl, and retreated into the shadows. I grabbed Kyle, pulling him to his feet. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted out of the cabin. Rick was on the ground, clutching his side but alive. We made it to the clearing before I dared to look back. The figure was standing in the doorway, watching us, but it didn't follow. We helped Rick up, and with Kyle between us, we made our way back to the campsite as fast as we could. The whole time, I felt like we were being hunted, the trees closing in around us. But we didn't stop, didn't look back, until we were safely at the ranger station. Kyle's parents were relieved, their gratitude evident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Rick was taken to the hospital, his wound deep but not life-threatening. I stayed behind, trying to piece together what had happened. The authorities were called, and a search was conducted. But the cabin was never found. Kyle's memory was hazy, filled with fragments of a nightmare he couldn't fully recall. He mentioned being lured by a voice, something that seemed human but wasn't. Weeks passed, and the incident was quietly swept under the rug. Officially, it was chalked up to a bear attack, though anyone who'd seen the wounds knew better. Rick recovered, but he left the job soon after. Said he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. I stayed on, but Blackwood Hollow became a place I avoided. The forest felt different, like it had secrets best left undisturbed. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I sometimes hear that faint cry, a reminder of the things that lurk in the shadows of our world. Years later, the memory still haunts me. Not just the encounter, but the sense of helplessness. The realization that there are things out there beyond our understanding. Kyle grew up, moved away, tried to forget. But I couldn't. It became a part of me, a shadow that followed wherever I went. One night, I was having a beer with an old friend, Jason. He was another ranger, one who had his own stories of the strange and unexplainable. We were sitting on my porch watching the stars when I finally told him about that night in Blackwood Hollow. He listened, a thoughtful look on his face, then nodded. "I've heard similar stories," he said. "Different places, different faces, but the same kind of presence. Some say it's a spirit. Others think it's something more primal, more ancient." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his words hanging in the air. It didn't bring me comfort, but it felt good to share the burden, to know I wasn't alone in my experience. Life went on, as it does. I kept doing my job, helping those lost in the wilderness, always with a cautious eye on the tree line. I never went back to Blackwood Hollow, and neither did Rick. It became one of those places with a story attached, a whispered legend among the rangers. In the end, I think that's what it was, a legend, something that exists on the edges of our reality, only revealing itself when we stray too far into the unknown. And maybe that's for the best. Some things are meant to remain hidden, their mysteries left unsolved. I still wonder about that night, about what I saw and what might have happened if we hadn't escaped. It's a question that lingers, unanswered, a reminder of the thin line between our world and whatever lies beyond. And as long as I'm alive, I'll carry that memory with me, a testament to the things we'll never fully understand. It all started with an offhand joke. You hear enough bad jokes in my line of work, but this one stood out. It was 2004, somewhere deep in the North Carolina woods, the kind of place tourists don't even know exists. I had been on 100 missions before, but this one seemed simple. Find the locals who had gone missing and bring them back, dead or alive. I joined the Green Berets for the adrenaline, for the chance to do something meaningful. But over the years, that rush started to fade, until that damn joke. Some of the local cops, the ones I was meant to coordinate with, had this thing where they'd whisper around me like they were afraid to say something out loud. One of them, a big guy named Remy, who always chewed tobacco and spat on his own boots, leaned in one night while I was cleaning my rifle and said, "The woods don't like strangers much. They got their own rules. And yeah, sometimes they eat folks who break them." I remember rolling my eyes and grunting something about old wives' tales, but it stuck with me. I mean, I'd been through enough to know that when locals get weird, there's usually a reason. So I took it as a heads up, though I didn't believe in superstitions. Not then, anyway. By the time we got out there, me, Remy, and a few other locals we picked up, the sun was slipping low behind the trees, giving us just enough time to set up a base camp. I didn't like the idea of working with the local guys, especially Remy, who cracked more jokes than a man should, but orders are orders. One of them, Pete, had lived out here all his life. He swore he'd seen bears doing strange things, but I didn't pay it much mind. Bears don't take people whole, and they sure as hell don't drag them away without leaving a mess. Remy, Pete, and I split up to cover more ground. Remy took the creek bed. Pete took the ridge above it. That left me with the thickest part of the woods where the trees leaned in close like a suffocating crowd. I could feel the humidity seeping through my clothes. The air smelled like pine and something rotten underneath. It wasn't long before I found my first clue. A bloody shirt, half buried under a pile of leaves. Like something had tried to hide it, but didn't care to do it right. The thing about finding blood is, it's never a good sign. But this wasn't the splatter of a struggle or the spray you get when something big goes down. No, this was something else. Methodical. I pressed on, radioing Remy and Pete every 15 minutes like we'd planned. No answers, but I could hear faint static, just enough to know the radios weren't dead. It's just that they weren't responding. By dusk, I found more. Pieces of a tent, torn like they'd been shredded by claws, though not the kind you'd expect. No signs of struggle, no trap, just a creeping sense that something was off. Then I found the bones, not scattered, not chewed, laid out in a pattern. Deliberate, like someone had taken their time setting them out, like a child making a stick figure in the dirt. There was no mistaking it. Human. I cracked another joke over the radio, something dumb about arts and crafts, but got nothing back. The silence sat heavy, but I pushed on. Maybe they were messing with me, trying to scare the new guy from out of town. That's when I heard it. A snapping sound. Low to the ground, like someone or something. Breaking branches. I kept my rifle at the ready and pushed through a thicket. That's when I spotted Remy's body, or at least what was left of it. Slumped against a tree, his guts spilled out like someone had unzipped him. There was no sign of Pete. I didn't get close enough to see much more, because of what stood over Remy's corpse. It looked like a wolf. If wolves walked on two legs, its fur was matted, dripping with blood that wasn't its own. Its teeth, longer, thinner than they should be, gleamed in the dim light. It didn't look right. Didn't move right. My first thought was that maybe it was a man. Some freaky local in a getup, trying to scare me. But then it crouched low, sniffing at the air, and I knew better. This thing wasn't interested in me, at least not yet. I dropped down, hoping the thick brush would hide me, My breath came out in short bursts. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might hear me. I didn't have a clean shot. And this wasn't the kind of thing you wanted to miss. I watched it turn its head, almost like it was listening for something. Then it stood up and started walking toward the trees. Its limbs moved in jerky, unnatural ways, and I got the impression that whatever it was, it didn't belong in a world that made sense. I waited until it was far enough, then crawled back to where Remy lay, took what was left of his radio, and tried to call for backup. Static. Just static. Pete still wasn't responding either. I thought about turning back to camp, but I couldn't leave without knowing what happened to Pete. Maybe he found a way out. Maybe he was just lost in the dark. Or maybe he wasn't. I found Pete an hour later, hanging from a tree, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. Below him, more bones. Some fresh, some old. There was a skull, cracked open like a walnut, and for the first time in my life, I was scared in a way I hadn't been, even when bullets were flying. This wasn't just about some missing folks anymore. This was a burial ground, a damn feeding ground. I've seen death before, but not like this, not methodical, not like a ritual. I radioed again, whispering this time, as if keeping my voice low might make me less real to whatever was out there. My rifle felt heavy, useless, but I kept it clutched in my hands like a lifeline. I needed to find a way back, but then I heard that same snapping sound, closer this time. It didn't come from the ground. It came from above. That's when I saw them. More of those things, climbing through the treetops like giant bats, their limbs twisting around branches like they had extra joints. There were at least 3 of them, but they moved so fast I couldn't keep count. I stayed perfectly still, hoping they'd miss me, but one of them leapt down, landing in front of me with a soft thud, like a cat dropping from a fence. I didn't think. I fired, 3 rounds into its chest. It staggered back, but the thing didn't go down. It shrieked. Not like an animal, not like anything I had ever heard. A kind of sound that drilled into your skull and rattled around in your head. But it bled, and that gave me a sliver of hope. I fired again, aiming for its head, and this time it dropped, twitching on the ground like a dying fish. The others noticed. They dropped from the trees, their claws scraping bark as they hit the ground. I ran. I've never run so fast in my life, and I didn't look back, not even when I heard them crashing through the underbrush behind me. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were tearing apart, but I ran until I stumbled into a clearing and saw the lights of a cabin up ahead. I crashed through the door, slamming it shut behind me. An old man sat in a rickety chair by the fireplace, staring at me like I had just interrupted his dinner. He didn't seem surprised to see a soldier covered in blood, carrying a smoking rifle. He just looked at me, his expression flat, like he was watching a rerun of a TV show he'd seen 1,000 times before. I asked him if he had a phone, a radio, anything. He just shook his head and said, "They come for what they want, and then they leave. Always have." He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared past me, like he was looking through the walls. He started talking about the woods like they were alive, about how sometimes the forest decides who stays and who goes. I didn't have time for his riddles. I barricaded the windows, checked my ammunition, and asked him if he knew a way out. He just laughed, this low, gravelly sound that echoed in the small room. "You don't get out, son. You just survive." And then he went quiet, staring into the flames as if that was all that mattered. I watched through the window as the things circled the cabin, their silhouettes barely visible in the shadows beyond the firelight. One of them came closer, dragging something behind it. Pete's body. It left him just outside, like bait. That's when I made my decision. I grabbed a lantern and the last of my ammunition and told the old man to stay inside. He just nodded like he'd heard it all before. I stepped outside, the cold hitting me like a slap. They were waiting, their heads cocked to one side, like they were curious, like they wanted to see what I'd do. I lit the lantern, smashed it against the cabin wall, and watched as the flames leapt up, catching on the dry wood. I figured if I couldn't get out, I'd take them down with me. The fire spread fast, crackling through the walls, but the creatures didn't flinch. They just watched as the flames consumed the cabin. That's when I realized the old man wasn't just resigned. He was one of them, or something like them, part of whatever lived out there in the woods. I shot at one of the creatures, catching it in the leg. It stumbled, but didn't go down. The others lunged. I fought like hell, but they were faster. One of them grabbed my arm, twisting it until I heard the snap. I dropped to the ground, fighting the pain as I clawed for my rifle, but they knocked it out of reach. Then they stopped. One of them let out a high-pitched yelp, and the others retreated into the shadows as if called back. I lay there, panting, my vision swimming. And then I saw it, their leader, standing on two legs, staring at me with something like curiosity. It leaned down close, sniffing the air, and then it turned and loped off into the trees, dragging Pete's body with it. I don't know why they left me alive. Maybe it was some twisted game. Maybe it was their way of letting me deliver the message. But as I lay there, staring up at the burning cabin, I realized what the old man meant. You don't get out. You just survive. And they let you remember. By dawn, a search party found me. They didn't find the old man, and they sure as hell didn't find Pete. They asked me what happened, but I didn't give them any answers they'd believe. They patched me up, got me out of the woods, and that was that. I left without saying a word. I got out, sure. But sometimes I think about Remy, about Pete, about what those things really are. Part animal, part nightmare. Maybe they were here long before us, just waiting for the woods to change back to the way they liked it. And then I heard the final joke from one of the locals, the one that almost made me laugh. Maybe the woods just didn't like your joke, stranger. My name is Timothy Perez. I was 27 years old when it happened. I don't tell this story because I want to. I tell it because I need to. People need to know what's out there, what's hiding in the places the maps call wild and empty. I used to think nothing scared me. I don't think that anymore. It was supposed to be a week-long RV trip through Florida's backwoods. Just me, my girlfriend Lisa, my best friend Tommy, and his buddy Trevor. We had planned it for months, an escape from the city, from our jobs, from reality. Tate's Hell State Forest sounded perfect. Isolated, beautiful, untouched. A little too untouched, as we would soon learn. The trouble started before we even reached our campsite. We were deep in the forest when the RV jolted violently, throwing Lisa against the window. The sound of crunching metal and hissing air followed. I slammed on the brakes. "What the hell was that?" Tommy asked, his hands gripping the dashboard. I jumped out to check. The front tire was shredded, destroyed by a row of rusted nails hidden beneath a layer of leaves and mud. Someone had put them there. "This isn't normal," Lisa muttered, standing beside me. Her auburn hair clung to her face in the humid air, her green eyes scanning the trees like they were watching her back. "Who the hell booby-traps a road?" "Poachers," Tommy guessed. "Or just some wanting to mess with tourists." Trevor, the quietest of us, crouched near the tire. "We're stuck." He wasn't wrong. We had no cell service, no spare, and no way to call for help. The nearest ranger station was a long, miserable hike away. I suggested we camp for the night and figure it out in the morning. Everyone agreed, though Lisa looked uneasy. That night, things got worse. It started with the noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees. But it wasn't. I heard whispers, low, breathy voices, laughter, the kind of laughter that didn't belong. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered, gripping my arm. "Yeah," I admitted. Tommy unzipped the tent. "The hell is out there?" Trevor was already up, staring into the darkness. "Footsteps," he murmured. "Barefoot. We found the prints in the morning. Large, human, but wrong, too long, too narrow, like someone had been walking on the edges of their feet. They circled our campsite, never coming closer than a few yards. Then we found the doll. It was sitting on a log near the fire pit, a small, crude thing made of sticks and twine, its mouth sewn shut with what looked like human hair. Lisa refused to touch it. No, this is some Blair Witch." Trevor picked it up, inspecting the dark stains on its arms. Dried blood. We should have left then. But we didn't. We were arrogant. We thought we could handle it. That afternoon, Trevor went missing. He said he was going to take a leak and never came back. At first, we laughed it off, thinking he was messing with us. But when an hour passed, we started searching. We found his flashlight lying in the dirt. The lens cracked. His footprints stopped suddenly, like he had been lifted off the ground. Lisa wanted to leave. Tommy agreed. I told them we had to find Trevor first, and then he came back. It was just before sunset when he walked into camp. His clothes were dirty, his face blank. "Jesus, Trevor, where the hell have you been?" I demanded. "Got lost," he said. His voice was flat. "Wrong." Lisa grabbed my arm and whispered, "That's not Trevor." I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. That night I woke up to whispering. I rolled over and saw Trevor sitting outside the tent, his back to me, mumbling to something I couldn't see. "Trevor?" He turned his head slightly, but not all the way. "Go back to sleep." I didn't. In the morning, Lisa pulled me aside. "Something's wrong with him, Timothy." "Yeah," I admitted. "But what do? We leave. Now." Before we could, Tommy went missing. We searched all day, shouting his name, finding nothing but broken branches and deep, sunken footprints leading into the swamp. "He's gone," Lisa whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Then we heard the scream. It was distant but unmistakable. Tommy. He was alive. He was in trouble. Trevor turned to us, grinning for the first time in days. "We should go after him." Something about the way he said it made my stomach turn. Still, I grabbed a knife and a flashlight, and Lisa followed. We ran toward the sound, deeper into the forest. The air grew thick with the stench of rot. Then we saw the pit. It was a deep hole, lined with sharpened sticks. Bones littered the bottom. Human bones. And Tommy was there, bound and gagged, his eyes wide with terror. "Jesus!" I jumped down, cutting the ropes around his wrists. "Who did this to you?" Before he could answer, something hit me. Hard. When I came to, Lisa was screaming. I was tied to a wooden post, my arms wrenched behind my back. Firelight flickered, revealing figures moving through the trees. Thin, half-naked men and women with hollow eyes and sharpened teeth. They grinned at me, their mouths smeared with blood. Cannibals. And standing among them, smiling like he belonged, was Trevor. "Trevor," I croaked. He crouched beside me. "You shouldn't have come looking for Tommy." I struggled, but the ropes were too tight. Lisa was tied next to me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "You were always the hero," Trevor whispered. "Always the one everyone looked up to. But out here, you're nothing." I spat at him. "You're insane." He wiped his face and smirked. "You'll see. Soon enough." The cult leader approached, his face covered in scars. He muttered something in a language I didn't recognize, then pointed at Lisa. Two men grabbed her. She screamed. I thrashed against my restraints. "No, take me instead." Trevor leaned in. "That's not how this works." I did the only thing I could. I bit down on the rope, sawing at it with my teeth. The fibers tore against my tongue. Then I heard Lisa cry out in pain. I snapped. With a final yank, the rope gave. I ripped my arms free and grabbed a burning log from the fire. I swung it into the nearest cannibal's face, the heat peeling skin from bone. Lisa kicked the man holding her. I grabbed a knife from the ground and cut her loose. Then we ran. The cult screamed behind us, their footsteps slamming against the dirt. I didn't look back. Somewhere in the chaos, Trevor shouted, "Timothy, wait!" I turned and saw him standing at the tree line, his face twisted in something like regret. "Please," he begged. "I didn't want this." Lisa raised the knife. I hesitated. Then I saw his smile flicker back. I stabbed him in the throat. We found the road just as a truck came around the bend. The driver nearly crashed trying to avoid us. We never spoke to the police. There was nothing to find. No evidence, no bodies, only nightmares. And sometimes, late at night, I think about Trevor. And I wonder if I really killed him. My name is Brian Patel, and back in 2021, I embarked on an RV camping trip to the remote stretches of Idaho's Sawtooth National Forest. Ever since I was a kid, I found solace in the great outdoors. It's where I feel most at home, away from the hustle of city life and the constant ping of notifications. I had recently purchased a second-hand RV, a bit rusty around the edges, but still reliable. Friends joked that it had more character than horsepower. But I liked it that way. I stocked up on essentials, loaded my mountain bike, and set off with the kind of optimism you get when escaping routine. The drive was tranquil, the kind where the radio fades into the background, and you're left alone with your thoughts. Pine trees blurred past as I navigated winding roads that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere all at once. About 100 miles into the forest, I found a clearing by a serene lake that looked like a postcard come to life. Setting up camp was straightforward. I parked the RV to face the water, propped open a chair, and cracked open a cold beer. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, reflecting off the lake's mirror-like surface. It was the kind of beauty that made you wonder why you didn't do this more often. The first night was uneventful, filled with the comforting sounds of nature. Crickets chirped in a harmonious chorus, while the gentle lapping of water against the shore acted as a lullaby. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in a blanket of stars visible through the RV's skylight. The next morning, I decided to take my bike out for a trail ride. The path was rugged, peppered with roots and rocks that demanded focus, a welcome challenge. About 5 miles in, I noticed something odd, a series of wooden symbols carved into the trees. They were intricate, almost artistic, but gave off an unsettling vibe. One looked like an eye, another like a hand, and others were shapes I couldn't decipher. I shrugged it off as local art, or perhaps markers left by hikers. Maybe someone was trying to be the next Banksy of the wilderness. Still, a joke formed in my mind. If a tree gets vandalized in the forest and no one's around to see it, does it lower the property value? As the day wore on, the trail became denser. The canopy overhead thickened, allowing slivers of sunlight to pierce through like spotlights on a dim stage. I was about to turn back when I stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin hidden behind a curtain of ivy and overgrown bushes. Curiosity got the better of me. The cabin looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Stepping inside, I was hit by a musty odor, a mix of damp wood and something else, something metallic. The interior was sparse, a broken table, a moldy chair, and strange symbols similar to the ones on the trees etched onto the walls. A sense of unease settled in my stomach. Maybe it's time to head back, I thought. But as I turned to leave, my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw the edge of a rug protruding from under the debris. I pulled it back to reveal a trapdoor. Now, any sensible person might have left right then, but I've been told that my curiosity could be the death of me. Hopefully just a figure of speech. I lifted the trapdoor, revealing a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. Using the flashlight from my bike kit, I illuminated the passageway. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the walls worn, with roots protruding like skeletal fingers. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a larger space, a room lined with shelves filled with jars. As I approached, the contents became horrifyingly clear. Preserved animals, odd specimens floating in formaldehyde, and other things that made my skin crawl. Then I saw them, photographs pinned to a corkboard, images of people, candid shots taken from a distance, hikers, campers, families. My breath caught in my throat when I recognized myself in one of the photos, taken at the lake where I'd set up camp. The caption scribbled below read, "New arrival. Alone." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Jokes aside, this was no laughing matter. I had to get out of there. As I turned to leave, a faint sound echoed down the tunnel, the unmistakable creak of the cabin's front door. Panic surged through me. I doused the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, listening intently. Footsteps moved overhead, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they were dragging something heavy. The sound of metal scraping against wood sent a shiver down my spine. I needed an escape route. Scanning the room, I noticed a narrow passage partially hidden behind a shelf. It was a tight squeeze, but it might be my only way out. I squeezed through, the rough walls scraping against my jacket. The passage led upward, curving slightly, until I found myself behind a thicket a few yards from the cabin. Peering through the leaves, I saw him. A tall, gaunt man with unkempt hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. He wore a stained flannel shirt and carried an old axe over his shoulder. He dropped a large sack onto the ground with a thud. Something rolled out, a deer carcass. Relief washed over me momentarily, until he pulled out a large hunting knife and began to skin the animal with unsettling precision. There was something methodical, almost ritualistic about his movements. I knew I had to get back to my RV and leave immediately. Keeping low, I moved silently through the underbrush, every snapped twig sounding like a gunshot in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the trail and mounted my bike, pedaling as fast as I could. The forest, which had seemed so inviting before, now felt like it was closing in on me. Shadows stretched longer, and every rustle of leaves sounded like impending danger. I reached my campsite, adrenaline pumping. Throwing my bike aside, I jumped into the RV and fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I didn't bother securing anything inside. Getting out was the only priority. As I steered onto the narrow road, a figure emerged from the tree line ahead, the same man from the cabin. He stood in the middle of the path, eyes fixed on me. There was no time to stop. I veered off to the side, the RV's tires crunching over rocks and roots. He didn't follow. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him watching me disappear down the road, a sinister smile creeping across his face. I drove non-stop until I reached the nearest town, a small community called Stanley. Pulling into a gas station, I parked and tried to collect myself. My hands trembled as I dialed the local sheriff's office. An officer named Deputy Harris arrived shortly after. He was a stout man with a firm handshake and a skeptical gaze. I recounted everything, the cabin, the photos, the man. He took notes but maintained a stoic expression. "You're not the first to report something like this," he admitted. "We've had a few hikers go missing over the past decade, but we've never found any concrete evidence." "Well, now you have a location," I insisted. "You have to check it out." He nodded. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, I'd advise you to stay in town until we get this sorted." I agreed, though the idea of spending more time in the area was less than appealing. I checked into a small motel, the kind where the floral wallpaper hasn't changed since the 70s. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the building made me jump. Around midnight, hunger got the better of me, and I decided to visit the all-night diner across the street. The place was nearly empty, except for a waitress and a lone customer seated at the counter. I took a booth by the window and ordered a coffee and a slice of pie. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, gave me a sympathetic smile. "Rough night?" she asked. "You could say that," I replied. The door chimed as another patron entered. Glancing up, my heart skipped a beat. It was the man from the cabin. He looked different, cleaner somehow, dressed in a plaid shirt and jeans. He walked in casually and took a seat at the counter, 2 stools away from the other customer. Was it really him? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I couldn't be sure. I decided to play it cool and not draw attention to myself. The waitress greeted him warmly. "Evening, Caleb. The usual?" He nodded. "Thanks, Margie." Caleb. That was his name. He seemed familiar to her. A regular, maybe? I was mistaken, perhaps. Just a case of small-town residents bearing a resemblance to one another. I overheard snippets of their conversation. "How's the farm?" Margie asked. "Can't complain. Harvest season's been kind to us," he replied. I felt a wave of relief. This man seemed normal, friendly even. Maybe the stress was getting to me, causing me to see threats where there were none. Just then, the other customer at the counter stood up to leave. As he turned, I caught his face, a rugged-looking fellow with a scar running down his cheek. He gave me a nod and exited the diner. Caleb watched him leave, his friendly demeanor slipping ever so slightly. His gaze then shifted, locking eyes with me. A sly grin formed on his lips. "You're not from around here, are you?" he called out. I swallowed hard. "Just passing through," I answered. He picked up his coffee mug and walked over to my booth. "Mind if I join you?" Actually, I did mind, but I couldn't think of a polite way to refuse. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. He slid into the seat across from me. Up close, I could see a small tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve, a series of symbols similar to those I'd seen carved into the trees and cabin walls. "Name's Caleb," he offered, extending his hand. "Brian," I replied, shaking it. "Unusual name. What's got you visiting our little corner of the world?" "Just some RV camping. Needed a break from city life." He nodded slowly. "The forest can be a peaceful place, or not, depending on where you wander." There was an edge to his voice now. The friendly facade was fading. "Yeah, had a bit of a scare earlier," I admitted, hoping honesty might diffuse whatever this was. "Came across an old cabin. Thought I saw something strange." "Strange things have a way of finding strangers," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. Margie interrupted by bringing over his meal, a bowl of chili and a slice of cornbread. "Here you go, hun." "Thanks," he replied, but his focus remained on me. I decided to test the waters. "You ever hear stories about that area? Maybe about people going missing?" He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Can't say I have, but then again, folks around here tend to mind their own business." Silence hung between us. I felt an urgent need to leave. "Well, it's getting late. I should probably head back." He smiled. "Of course. Don't let me keep you." I left a few bills on the table and stood up. As I turned to go, he spoke again. "Be careful out there, Thaddeus. The woods aren't always as empty as they seem." I hurried back to the motel, every instinct telling me to get out of town immediately. Back in my room, I packed my belongings and decided to drive through the night. As I exited the motel, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. Unfolding it, I saw it was one of the photographs from the cabin. This one of me, sitting by the lake, circled in red ink. Panic surged anew. I jumped into the RV and sped off, not caring about speed limits or the noise of the engine. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw headlights turn on and follow, but I couldn't be sure. After hours of driving, I crossed state lines and didn't stop until I reached a large town with plenty of people around. A few days later, I contacted the state police, providing them with all the information I had. They took my statement seriously and assured me they'd investigate. Weeks went by, and I received a call from a detective, Monroe. "We searched the area you mentioned," he said. "Found the cabin and the underground room." "Did you find anything?" I asked. Place was cleared out. No jars, no photographs, just an empty space. "What about the man? Caleb?" "Local records show no one by that name matching your description. The diner you mentioned burned down last year. Margie, the waitress, died in the fire." A cold realization settled in. None of it made sense. Determined to find answers, I did some digging of my own. Online forums, local newspaper archives, anything that could shed light on what I'd experienced. I stumbled upon an old article from 1995 about a man named Caleb Foster, a farmer who was suspected of multiple disappearances but was never charged. He died in a car crash 2 decades ago, but that was impossible. I'd met him, or someone pretending to be him. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered in that small Idaho town. But I do know one thing. Some roads are better left untraveled.